Luke Walker ripped the letter clean in half and threw both pieces into the dust. Plain, he'd written. Send me a plain woman kind enough to love a lonely child. Now the whole town of Abilene stood laughing on that train platform because the woman climbing down the steps was near 300 pounds and 4 grown men couldn't even lift her trunk. Somebody hollered, "That agency cheated you, Walker." Luke's jaw went tight. He had no idea that Iron Trunk held a fortune that would change everything. Before we go on, if this story pulls at your heart the way it pulls at mine, take a second to subscribe and follow all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I truly love seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in, folks, because this one is just getting started. The letter had taken Luke Walker 3 whole nights to write, and he'd meant every plain word of it. He sat now on the hard bench of the Abilene Depot with his hat crushed in both hands, watching the empty rails shimmer in the August heat, and he told himself for the 100th time that a man did what he had to do. He was 38 years old. His wife had been dead 3 years. His daughter needed a mother, and the good Lord had not seen fit to send one through the ordinary channels. So Luke had gone and sent away for one through the mail, the way a man orders seed corn or a new plow blade. And he wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't ashamed neither. "Pa." Emily tugged at his sleeve. She was 6 years old and small for it, with her mother's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin. "Pa, is she gonna like me?" "Course she is, darlin'." "How do you know?" Luke looked down at his girl. "I told her about you in the letter. Told her you was the best little gal in all of Texas. Any woman'd be lucky to have you." Emily considered that. "Did you tell her I lost my front tooth?" "I didn't reckon that was the most important part. It's important to me." "Then you can tell her yourself soon as she gets here." The truth was, Luke had told the woman almost nothing about himself and everything about the child. He'd been careful in that letter, careful as a man crossing a rotten bridge. He had not mentioned the drought that had baked his rangeland to powder. He had not mentioned the note the cattleman's bank held over his ranch, the one that came due in November, the one that kept him awake staring at the ceiling till the rooster crowed. He had not mentioned that he'd buried a wife he loved more than his own breath, and that some mornings he still reached across the empty side of the bed before he came all the way awake. He'd written only the one honest thing. "Send me a plain woman, someone kind enough to love a lonely child." And now the train was coming, and Luke's heart was going like a hammer on cold iron, because for all his talk to Emily, he did not know one blessed thing about the woman who was writing it. The depot began to fill. That was the part Luke hadn't counted on. A man in a small town could not do a private thing to save his soul. And half of Abilene had somehow got wind that Luke Walker's mail-order bride was arriving on the noon train. They came drifting in ones and twos, the ranchers and their wives, the store clerks, the loafers off the porch of the mercantile, and they arranged themselves along the platform with the bright, hungry faces of folks who have come to see a show. "Afternoon, Luke," said Carl Dunmore. Luke nodded without turning his head. Dunmore owned the biggest spread in the county and never let a man forget it. His boys stood behind him, 2 thick-necked young fellows who'd never had to worry over a banknote in their lives. "Big day for you," Dunmore went on. "Whole town's talkin'. Man sends clear off to St. Louis for a wife. Folks get curious." "Folks ought to mind their own affairs." Dunmore chuckled. "Now don't be sore. We come to wish you well. Ain't that right, boys?" The boys grinned like they'd been coached. Luke set his teeth and said nothing. He'd known this was coming from the moment he'd mailed the letter. A widower with a failing ranch and a motherless child sending away for a stranger because no woman in 3 counties would have him and his troubles. He knew what they thought of him. He'd have thought the same in their boots. "Pa," Emily whispered, pressing close against his leg. "Why are all these people here?" "They're just nosy sugar. Pay 'em no mind." Then the whistle came long and low across the flats, and every head on the platform turned toward the sound. The train came in slow, all iron and steam and screaming brakes, and the crowd pressed forward, and Luke stood up off the bench and put his hat on his head and took Emily's small hand in his big rough one. His mouth had gone dry as chalk. Somewhere on that train was the woman he had promised to marry. He had a preacher lined up for Saturday. He had a room made ready. He had done everything a decent man could do, and now he was about to find out what kind of luck a decent man could expect. The cars shuddered to a stop. Doors opened. Passengers began to step down a drummer with his sample cases. An old couple, a young mother with a baby, and the crowd watched each one and murmured, "Is that her? No, is that her?" And then Margaret Bennett came down the steps, and the whole platform went quiet. She was a large woman. There was no soft way to say it, and no way to miss it. She stood near 300 pounds broad through the shoulders and broad through the middle, and her plain brown traveling dress had been let out at every seam it had, and still pulled tight across her frame. Her face was round and plain, and flushed with the heat. Her hair was pinned up simple under a plain straw hat. She carried a small carpet bag in both hands, held in front of her like a shield, and she came down those iron steps, careful one at a time, testing each one before she trusted it with her weight. For one long second, nobody said a word. Then a man near the back of the crowd laughed. It was a short, ugly bark of a laugh, and it broke the silence like a rock through a window, and after it came, the whispers low and quick, and running through the crowd like fire through dry grass. "Lord have mercy, would you look at that? That's her. That's Walker's bride. Reckon they sent him 2 women's worth." Somebody at that agency's got a mean sense of humor. Carl Dunmore laughed out loud, not troubling to hide it. "Well now, Luke," he said, "looks like you got your money's worth after all." His boys howled. Luke Walker stood frozen. He heard the laughter. He heard the whispers. He felt the whole town watching him to see what his face would do, and he knew the way a man knows a storm is coming by the ache in an old wound, that whatever he did in the next 10 seconds, they would talk about it for the next 10 years. And inside his chest, God forgive him, he felt it too. The disappointment. It came up cold and heavy and shameful, because he was only a man, and he had spent 3 lonely nights writing that letter, and some foolish part of him had hoped without ever saying so, even to himself, that maybe the woman who stepped off that train might be someone he could learn to look at across a supper table without his heart going hollow. Margaret Bennett stood at the bottom of the steps with her carpet bag held in front of her, and she heard every word of it. That was the thing Luke would remember later when he was ashamed of himself. She heard all of it. The laughing, the whispering, Dunmore's cruelty, and she did not flinch. She did not drop her eyes or hurry off or crumble the way Luke half expected her to. She simply stood there straight-backed and steady, and let the whole ugly wave of it wash over her like she'd stood in that same water 1,000 times before and learned exactly how to keep her feet. Her eyes moved over the crowd, calm and searching, until they found Luke. "Mr. Walker," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I'm Margaret Bennett." Luke's tongue felt like a boot in his mouth. He was aware of Emily's hand in his, of the whole town's eyes on his back, of Dunmore's grin. He was aware that a better man than him would already have stepped forward, tipped his hat, said something kind. And he stood there and couldn't do a single one of those things. It was Emily who moved. The child let go of her father's hand and walked straight across that platform, small and dark-haired and gap-toothed, right up to the big woman in the brown dress, and she looked up the whole long way to Margaret's face, and she said, clear as a church bell, "Are you my new mama?" The platform went dead silent again, and something happened in Margaret Bennett's plain, flushed face. Something moved through it like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. She set her carpetbag down on the board, slow and careful, and she got herself down on one knee, which was no small thing for a woman her size, and she brought herself right level with the little girl, so they were eye to eye. "Well," Margaret said softly, "that depends on you, I reckon. What's your name?" "Emily Walker. I'm 6. Emily held up the fingers to prove it. Then she leaned in and whispered loud enough for the whole front row to hear, "I lost my front tooth. See?" She grinned wide, and Margaret Bennett laughed a real laugh, warm and full, and she said, "Why, that is the finest missing tooth I ever did see. You know what that means, don't you? Means you're growing. Means you're a big girl now." Emily beamed like she'd been handed the moon. Somewhere behind Luke, One of the ranch wives said quiet, "Oh, hush," to somebody who'd started to snicker, and the snickering stopped. Luke found his legs at last. He crossed the platform, and he took off his hat, and he stood there in front of the woman kneeling by his daughter, and he said the only true thing he could find. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm Luke Walker. I should have come to you first." Margaret got to her feet. It took her a moment, and Luke put out a hand without thinking, and she took it, and he felt the strength in her grip more than he expected a working woman's hand under all that softness. "You've got nothing to be sorry for, Mr. Walker," she said. "I know what folks see. I've had a good long while to get used to it." She smoothed her dress. "I'd rather be judged for what I do than what I look like, but a body doesn't always get the choosing." Luke didn't know what to say to that. It was more honest than anything the town had managed all afternoon. "Well," Dunmore called out, still grinning, "you gonna feed her Walker, or is she gonna feed you?" A few nervous laughs. Luke turned around slow. He was not a big talker, and he was not a fighting man by nature, but there was a line in him way down deep that his father had put there with a hard hand and harder words, and Carl Dunmore had just stepped across it. "Carl," Luke said, and his voice was quiet, which was worse than loud. "You've had your fun. Now you can shut your mouth or you can settle it with me. Your choice." The grin faded off Dunmore's face. He was a big man, and a rich one, but Luke Walker had a reputation quiet as it was for meaning exactly what he said, and no more, and there was something in the rancher's eyes right then that no sensible man would want to push. "No call to get sore, Luke," Dunmore muttered. "Only making conversation." "Then make it somewhere else." The crowd began to break up. There's nothing a crowd loves less than a show that ends without a fight, and slow in ones and twos, the way they'd come. The good folks of Abilene drifted off back to their business, throwing looks over their shoulders and saving up the story to tell at supper. That was when the trunk came off the train. Luke heard the commotion before he saw it, a grunting and cursing and a heavy scrape of iron on wood, and he turned to see two of the railroad hands at the baggage car, struggling with the biggest trunk he had ever laid eyes on. It was an old thing, bound all around with black iron bands, iron corners, an iron hasp with a great brass lock hanging off it. It was the size of a horse trough and looked to weigh about as much as a horse. The two men had got it to the edge of the car and could get it no farther, and one of them called for help, and a third man climbed up, and then a fourth, and the four of them together, red-faced and swearing, wrestled that trunk down onto the platform, where it landed with a boom that Luke felt through his boot soles. "What in the world?" one of the hands panted. "Has this woman got in here? Feels like she packed the whole state of Missouri." Margaret walked over to it, unhurried, and laid one hand flat on the iron lid, the way a person might lay a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. "Everything I still own," she said quietly, "is inside." Luke looked at the trunk. He looked at the woman. He looked back at the trunk. 4 grown men sweating and cussing, and they'd barely got it off the train. "Ma'am," he said, "that is a considerable amount of belongings." "I don't have much," Margaret said, "but what I have I keep close." Luke reckoned it was old dishes most likely. A woman's things. Iron pots maybe, or her mother's good china wrapped up in rags, or a lifetime of quilts and keepsakes that weighed more than a body would guess. He didn't think much more about it than that. A man with a banknote due in November and a drought killing his cattle did not have the leisure to wonder overlong about what a strange woman kept in her trunk. He had no way of knowing. No way in this world of knowing that the 4 sweating railroad men had just set down on the sun-warped boards of the Abilene depot a fortune large enough to buy Carl Dunmore's whole spread, and every man laughing on that platform and never feel the loss of it. "I'll need to borrow a wagon for it," Margaret said, "and some strong backs. I can pay for the trouble." "I got a wagon," Luke said. "We'll manage." They did not manage easily. It took Luke and the 4 railroad hands and a 5th man Luke hired off the street for 2 bits, all 5 of them heaving together to get that trunk up into the bed of the buckboard, and when it finally settled, the whole wagon sank on its springs, and the mules laid their ears back and stamped. Emily watched the whole business with round eyes. "What's in the big box?" she asked. "Treasures," Margaret told her. "Real treasures, like gold." Margaret smiled, but something flickered behind it, quick and gone. "Like memories," she said. "The kind you can't buy back once they're gone." The ride out to the ranch was near 2 hours, and for the first while, nobody said much. Luke drove. Margaret sat beside him on the seat with Emily wedged happy between them, and the loaded wagon groaned along the rutted road while the mules labored under the weight. It was Emily who filled the silence. Children have a mercy in them that grown folks lose, and Emily had no notion that there was anything a body ought not say. She told Margaret about her pony that wasn't really a pony, but an old sway-backed mare named Biscuit. She told her about the barn cat that had kittens. She told her about her mama that was in heaven, and how Pa didn't like to talk about her, and how she couldn't hardly remember her face anymore, and this last she said the way a child says a thing plain and terrible, staring straight ahead at the road. Luke's hands tightened on the reins. "You know what I found," Margaret said gently, "is that the ones we lose, they don't leave us all the way. They leave little pieces behind. In how you laugh, maybe. Or the color of your eyes. Bet you've got your mama's eyes." Emily looked up. "Pa says I do." "Then every time your pa looks at you," Margaret said, "he sees her too. That's not a sad thing, honey. That's a gift she left you both." Luke stared at the road ahead and did not trust himself to speak. In 3 years, no one, not the preacher, not his own kin, not one soul had said a thing to Emily about her mother that landed as soft and true as that. He stole a look at the woman beside him. Plain face, simple dress, hands folded in her lap. He'd been so busy being disappointed on that platform that he'd near missed the only thing that mattered, which was that his daughter, who had been shy and sad for 3 long years, was leaning against this stranger like she'd known her all her life. "You got children of your own, Miss Bennet?" he asked. Again that flicker across her face. "No," she said. "No, I never was blessed that way. But you know how to talk to 'em." "I had a lot of years," Margaret said, "with nobody much to talk to. Gives a body time to think on what matters, and children matter more than about anything I know of." They came up over the last rise as the sun was going down, and Luke's ranch spread out below them in the failing light, and he felt the old shame come up in him again, worse now because he was looking at it through a stranger's eyes. It wasn't much. The house was small, weathered gray, one room and a loft. The barn leaned. The corral rails wanted mending. And all around where 3 years back there'd been green grass to the horizon, there was nothing now but dust and dry brush and the bleached bones of the drought, and off in the near pasture, a handful of cattle, ribby and slow, that were all that remained of a herd that had once been the pride of the county. "That's it," Luke said. He kept his voice flat. "It ain't much to look at right now. Ranch has seen better days. I'll tell you plain, ma'am, since you'll find out anyhow. I'm behind on my note. Drought's been 3 years running. I got till November, and if it don't rain and my cattle don't fatten, the bank takes it all." He kept his eyes forward. "I didn't put that in the letter. Wasn't right to bring a woman out here on false pretenses. So there it is. That's what you married into. If you want to turn around and go on back to St. Louis, I'll understand it, and I'll pay your fare, and there won't be a hard word between us." For a long moment, Margaret didn't answer. Then she said, "Mr. Walker, can I tell you something?" "Go ahead." "I didn't come out here for a rich man." She was looking at the little gray house, at the leaning barn, at the girl asleep now between them, with her head lolled against Margaret's arm. "I've had about all I ever want of rich men. I came out here because a man wrote a letter that said he wanted somebody kind enough to love a lonely child. And I read that letter maybe 40 times, and I thought, there's a man who's got his priorities straight. There's a man who knows what a thing is worth." She turned and looked at him full. "So no, I don't reckon I'll be going back to St. Louis. Not if you'll have me, note or no note." Luke didn't have any words for that. He clucked to the mules and drove down toward the house, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched up tight for 3 years, eased just the smallest bit. Getting the trunk off the wagon and into the house was its own trial, and in the end they couldn't do it. Not that night. Not with just the two of them and Luke's ranch hand, old Pete, who was 70 if he was a day, and no help at all with dead weight. They got it as far as the porch and left it there under an oilcloth, and Margaret ran her hand once more over the iron lid before she went inside, and Luke saw her check the great brass lock with her thumb quiet, making sure it held. He noticed it. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. That first night Margaret cooked. There wasn't much to cook with. Luke had been living on beans and biscuit and whatever old Pete could shoot, and the larder was near bare. But Margaret went through it like a general surveying a battlefield, and out of flour and lard, and a few withered vegetables, and a hen that had quit laying, and was headed for the pot. Anyhow, she made a supper that filled the little house with a smell Luke hadn't smelled in 3 years. It was the smell of a home. He hadn't known how much he'd missed it till it was there, and it near took the legs out from under him. He stood in the doorway and watched this strange large woman moving around his dead wife's kitchen, and he did not know whether he wanted to weep or run, and he did neither. He just stood there with his hat in his hands, like a fool. Emily ate 3 helpings. "Slow down, sugar," Luke said. "Nobody's going to take it." "But it's good, Pa." Emily said it around a mouthful. "It's real good." Margaret sat across the table, and she didn't eat much herself. Luke noticed for all the town's cruel talk. She watched the child eat with a look on her face, like a woman watching something she'd waited her whole life to see. After supper, Margaret washed the dishes and put the kitchen to rights, and she found where things went and where things ought to go, and by the time she was done, the little house looked more cared for than it had since the day Luke buried his wife. Then she got Emily washed and into her nightclothes, and the child who fought sleep every night of her life like it was a personal enemy went easy and asked Margaret to hear her prayers, and Margaret did. Luke stood outside on the porch in the dark and listened through the window to his daughter's small voice, and the woman's low one answering, and he looked at the great iron trunk sitting there under its oilcloth in the moonlight, and he thought a man could get used to this. Then he thought about November and the bank, and he stopped thinking it. Later, when Emily was asleep in the loft and the lamp was turned down low, Luke and Margaret sat at the table across from one another, and there was the awkward business of 2 strangers who have promised to marry sitting in a quiet house at the end of a long day. "I'll take the barn," Luke said, "till Saturday, till it's proper. You and Emily take the house. There's a curtain I can rig for you some privacy." "That's decent of you. It's how it ought to be." He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. "Miss Bennet, I got to ask you something, and I'll ask it plain, and you can tell me it's none of my affair." "Go on. A woman like you." He stopped, started again, careful. "You talk fine. You carry yourself fine. You know your letters, I can tell, and your figures too. The way you looked over my ledger there while the beans was cooking, don't think I didn't see. And I got to wonder. A woman with your qualities. Why'd you go and answer a rancher's letter and come clear out to Nowhere, Texas to marry a stranger with a failing spread and a young'un? What is it you're running from?" The question hung in the air. Margaret was quiet a long moment. When she answered, she chose her words the way a person crosses a creek on stones, testing each one. "Everybody's running from something, Mr. Walker. You rode away for a bride because you were running from being alone. That's not a shameful thing. It's just a true one." She looked at her hands. "I answered your letter because I was running too, from a life that never fit me any better than this dress fits me, from people who only ever saw the outside of me and never once troubled to ask what was underneath." She met his eyes. "You want to know what I'm running from? I'm running toward Mr. Walker. First time in my life. I'm running toward that little girl asleep up in your loft, who looked at me on that platform in front of the whole cruel town and asked was I her mama. Nobody ever wanted me for a mama before. Nobody ever much wanted me for anything." Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone in the lamplight. "So you'll pardon me if I don't answer the question the way you're asking it. What I'm running from is my own business, and I'll tell it when I'm ready, and not a minute before. But what I'm running to, that I'll tell you free. I'm running to a family, and I don't aim to let anything, not your bank, not your neighbors, not the whole state of Texas, take it from me." "Madame," Luke sat back. He had married sight unseen out of desperation, expecting he hardly knew what, and here across his table sat a woman with more steel in her than half the men he knew, saying words that ought to have come out of a preacher's mouth. "Well," he said at last. "All right then." "All right then," Margaret agreed. And that was the first night. The days that came after were hard, harder than Margaret had bargained for, though she never once said so. She did not know ranch work. She had never in her life milked a cow, hauled water, gathered eggs, mended a fence, or done a single one of the 100 small brutal chores that a ranch demands from dark to dark. And she was a large woman doing them in the Texas heat, and the town watched, and the town talked. Luke saw her fall the second morning carrying water from the well. The full bucket caught her off balance, and down she went, hard in the dust, the water gone, her dress filthy, and Luke started toward her, but she was already getting up, waving him off, saying, "I'm fine, I'm fine." And she picked up the bucket and went back to the well and did it again, and this time she didn't fall. He saw her lose a fight with a milk cow that kicked the pail clear across the barn. He saw her come in from gathering eggs with her hands pecked bloody because she didn't yet know the trick of reaching under a broody hen. He saw all of it, and he said little because he had learned already that Margaret Bennett did not want his pity, and she did not want his help unless she asked for it, and she did not intend to be beaten by a bucket, or a cow, or a hen, or anything else on God's earth. But at night, when the day's failures were done, she was something else altogether. At night, she sat at the table with Luke's ledger open in front of her, and a lamp turned up and a pencil in her hand, and she went through his accounts, and here she was, no green ranch wife falling in the dust. Here she moved with the sure, quick hands of someone who had done this work before, real work, big work, and Luke, watching from across the room, felt the hair rise on his arms without quite knowing why. "Mr. Walker," she said one evening, maybe her 6th or 7th on the ranch, "how long you been selling your beef to this buyer, this Halloran out of Fort Worth?" "Halloran years, since before my wife passed." "Why?" "Because he's been cheating you," Margaret said, "for years." Luke set down his coffee. "Now hold on. I'm not guessing." She turned the ledger around so he could see it, and she laid her pencil along a column of figures. "Look here. Every season he pays you by the head, but the weights he's recording, they're low. Consistent low. 10-12 pounds a head, under what your own tallies say. Little enough you'd never catch it on one sale, but over 4 years on the number of head you've sold him." She tapped the paper. "This man has stolen better than $1,100 off you, Luke Walker, right out of this book. And I'd wager he's done it to every rancher in this county too green or too trusting to run the numbers." Luke stared at the page. $1,100. It was near exactly what he owed the bank. It was the difference between keeping his ranch and losing it. And it had been walking out the gate under his nose for 4 years, and he'd never once caught it, because he'd trusted a man in a good coat with a firm handshake. "How?" he said, and his voice came out rough. "How'd you see that I looked at these same numbers 100 times? "You looked at them like a rancher," Margaret said quietly. "I looked at them like somebody who spent her whole life watching men in good coats try to take what wasn't theirs. It's a different kind of looking, Mr. Walker." She closed the ledger. "You'll want to weigh your own beef next sale, on your own scale in front of a witness. And you'll want to write it all down. Because a man who'll cheat you with a pencil will lie to your face, and the only thing that stops him is figures he can't argue with." Luke didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the barn on his cot and stared up at the dark rafters, and thought about the woman in his house, the woman the whole town had laughed at, the woman who'd just found him $1,100 in an afternoon, and he thought there is more to Margaret Bennett than any of us has got the wit to see. Word of Margaret Walker did not stay on the ranch. It never does in a small place. By the second week the whole county had a name for her, and it wasn't a kind one. Luke first heard it from old Pete, who'd heard it in town, who was ashamed to say it, but figured Luke ought to know. "They're calling her the fat male bride boss," Pete said, turning his hat in his hands. "Down at the mercantile, and worse. Dunmore's woman been saying it loudest. Calling her the ranch's biggest mistake. saying you'll be sorry come winter when she's et you clean out of house and home." Luke's face went dark. "Dunmore's woman said that. Her and the rest of 'em. I'm sorry, boss. I just figured you'd rather hear it from me than off the street." Luke thanked him for it, and he did not tell Margaret because he could see no good in it. But he'd forgotten how a small town works. There is no protecting anybody from it. Margaret found out on her own, the way such women always do on a Thursday at the mercantile in town. She'd gone in for flour and coffee and thread, and Luke had gone off to see the smith about a wheel, and left her to her shopping. And by the time he came back, she was standing at the counter with 3 of the town's finest ladies, arranged behind her like crows on a fence. And one of them, Carl Dunmore's wife, was talking loud the way a person talks when they mean for you to hear. "Well, I only say what everybody's thinking, Verna. That poor man, motherless child and all. And this is what the agency sends him. I declare I don't know how a body eats enough to get that size out here, where the rest of us has to work for our bread." The storekeeper, a decent man named Fletcher, had gone red to his collar and was making a great business of measuring out flour and wishing he was anywhere else. Luke stopped in the doorway. Everything in him wanted to cross that floor and say something he'd regret. But before he could move, Margaret turned around. She turned around slow, and she looked at Mrs. Dunmore, and she did not raise her voice, and what she said calm. "Ma'am, you're right that I'm a large woman. There's no arguing it, and I won't try. But you're wrong about the rest, so I'll set you straight, seeing as you're so concerned for my husband." She counted it off on her fingers, mild as milk. "That man you're pitying got cheated $1,100 by his cattle buyer over 4 years, and I found it in his book in one evening, and come next sale, he'll get every cent of it back. His girl was crying herself to sleep for want of a mother, and she doesn't anymore. And his larder was near bare, and now it isn't." She set her basket on the counter. "So you go on and call me whatever suits you, Mrs. Dunmore. Fat and a mistake and the rest of it. I've heard worse from better. But you might ask yourself before you pity that man too hard, which of us has done more good for him this month, you or the mistake?" Nobody in that store said one word. Mrs. Dunmore's mouth opened and shut like a fish on a bank. Behind Margaret, old Fletcher, the storekeeper, made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been a laugh strangled halfway. "Well," Mrs. Dunmore managed at last, "I never." "No, ma'am," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "I don't reckon you have. Fletcher, I'll take the good coffee, not the chicory. My husband works too hard for chicory." She counted out her coins onto the counter, precise and unhurried. "Good day to you, ladies. It's been an education." And she gathered up her basket and walked out past the lot of them with her chin level and her back straight, and it was only when she was up in the wagon and out of their sight that Luke, climbing up beside her, saw that her hands were shaking. "You heard that," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I heard it. I'm sorry. I know a wife's supposed to keep the peace. I couldn't do it, not this time." Luke clucked to the mules and turned them for home, and for a while he didn't say anything, and then he said, "My first wife, God rest her, was the gentlest soul I ever knew. Never had a hard word for a living creature, and if she'd been in that store just now and heard Carl Dunmore's wife talk that way, she'd have gone home and cried about it for a week and never said boo." He glanced sideways. "You said your piece and walked out with your head up. And I want you to know, Margaret, I ain't never in my life been prouder to be standing next to somebody than I was in that doorway 2 minutes ago. So don't you dare apologize. Not to me. Not ever again for that." Margaret didn't answer. But her hands stopped shaking, and after a while, she reached over careful, like she wasn't sure she was allowed, and laid one of them over Luke's on the reins, just for a moment, and Luke let her, and neither of them said a word about it, and the mules carried them home. And every night, no matter how tired she was, no matter how the day had gone, Margaret did one thing before she slept. She went out to the porch, and she checked the trunk. Luke saw her do it. He wasn't spying exactly, but the barn door faced the house, and a man notices things. Every night, last thing, she'd go out in her nightclothes with a shawl thrown over, and she'd kneel down by that great iron trunk, and she'd try the brass lock with her hand, testing it, making sure. Sometimes she'd rest her palm flat on the lid a moment still, the way you'd calm a nervous animal. Then she'd go back inside. He never asked her about it. A man was entitled to his secrets. Luke figured, and so was a woman. And hadn't she told him plain that first night that she'd tell her business when she was ready and not before? So he held his peace. But he watched, and he wondered, and the wondering grew. Emily, of course, had no such restraint. "What's in the trunk, Mama?" she asked one evening. She'd taken to calling Margaret Mama by then, easy and natural, the way a child takes to a thing that feels right. And every time she said it, Luke saw Margaret's breath catch just slightly, like the word was a small miracle she hadn't got used to yet. "Treasures remember," Margaret said. "Can I see?" "Someday, when you're bigger." "But what kind of treasures?" Margaret pulled the child into her lap, which was ample and comfortable, and Emily settled there content as a cat. The kind, Margaret said, that a person keeps locked up not because they're worth so much money, but because they're worth so much everything else. You understand? "No," Emily said honestly. Margaret laughed. "Then I'll tell you this. There's things in that trunk that could buy this whole ranch 10 times over. And there's things in it worth more than all of that put together that couldn't buy you a stick of candy. And someday when the time's right, I'll open it up and show you every last piece. And I'll tell you the story of each one. But not tonight. Tonight it's time for a certain little girl to be in her bed." Luke, listening from the doorway, heard her say it. Things in that trunk that could buy this whole ranch 10 times over. He figured it for a bedtime tale, the kind you spin for a child. Buried treasure, pirate gold, the sort of thing that makes a youngin's eyes go wide. He figured it for a story. He was wrong. The wedding was Saturday, small and plain, in the front room of the preacher's house in town, with only old Pete and the preacher's wife for witnesses. Margaret wore the same brown dress, cleaned and pressed. Luke wore his one good shirt. Emily held a fistful of wildflowers she'd picked her own self along the road, already wilting in the heat, and she stood between them the whole ceremony and would not be moved. And when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, it was Emily who cheered one small, clear voice in the quiet room. They didn't kiss. It wasn't that kind of marriage, not yet, and both of them knew it. Luke took Margaret's hand and held it a moment, and that was all, and it was enough. Riding home in the wagon, Margaret Walker, as she was now, sat straight-backed beside her new husband, with the child dozing against her, and she looked out over the dry land, turning gold in the evening light, and she said, so quiet, Luke almost missed it, "Thank you." For what? For not being ashamed of me at that altar. Some men would have been. In front of the preacher. You weren't. Luke was quiet a while. Then he said, "Miss Bennett. Mrs. Walker, I mean. I'll tell you something, and then I'll not speak of it again because it shames me. That day at the depot, when you stepped off the train, I was disappointed. God's truth. I stood there disappointed, like the small, foolish man I am, and I near let this whole town's cruelty be my cruelty too." Margaret said nothing. She just listened. "And then my girl walked up to you," Luke went on, "and asked, was you her mama? And you got down on your knee in front of everybody, and you talked to her about her missing tooth, like it was the most important news in Texas. And I watched her face light up like I ain't seen it light up in 3 years. His voice went thick. "And I thought, Luke Walker, you damned fool. You've been looking at the wrong thing your whole life. You ordered a plain woman to love a lonely child, and God sent you exactly what you asked for, and you stood there sorry about it because she didn't fit some picture in your head." He shook his head slow. "The disappointment was mine. It was never yours. You've been the best thing to walk onto that ranch in 3 years, and I've known it since about the second day, and I was too proud and too foolish to say it. So I'm saying it now. I'm not disappointed, Margaret. I'm the luckiest man in this county, and the town can laugh all at once, because they don't know what I know." Margaret Walker turned her face away, out toward the gold and dying light, and Luke pretended not to see her wipe her eyes, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was for the first time an easy one. That night, after Emily was long asleep, Luke lay awake in the barn, as had become his habit, and through the open door he watched the house. And sure enough, late the door opened, and Margaret came out in her shawl and knelt by the trunk and tried the lock. But this night was different. This night she didn't go straight back in. This night she knelt there in the moonlight a long time, her hand flat on the iron lid, her head bowed, and Luke, watching, saw her shoulders begin to shake, and he understood after a moment that his wife was crying. Not the quiet leaking of tears he'd near caught in the wagon. This was something deeper, something that came up from the bottom of a person, and she knelt out there alone with her hand on that locked trunk and wept like her heart was breaking silent so as not to wake the child. And Luke lay in the dark and did not go to her, because some grief a person has to be let cry alone. But he heard her once speak into the night, just a few words low, meant for no living ears. "I'm sorry, Papa," Margaret Walker said to the locked trunk. "I'm so sorry, but I found it. After all this time, I finally found it." Then she got up and wiped her face and went inside, and the door closed soft behind her. Luke lay in the dark barn a long, long time after that. He did not know what was in the trunk. He did not know who Papa was, or what she was sorry for, or what it was she'd finally found after all this time. He did not know that 3 men in good Eastern coats were already boarding a train in Boston, with his wife's name written on a paper in their pocket. He did not know that the quiet life he'd only just dared to hope for was standing on the edge of a cliff. He knew only this: that the woman the whole town had laughed at was worth 10 of any of them. That his daughter had a mother again and slept sound in the loft with a smile on her face. And that somewhere inside that great iron trunk on his porch was a secret his wife carried like a stone in her chest, heavy enough to weep over in the dead of night, heavy enough that 4 grown men could barely lift it. Whatever it was, Luke Walker decided lying there in the dark he would stand by her when it came. Whatever it was. He had no idea how soon he'd have to. Out on the porch, the moon shone down on the iron trunk on its black bands and its brass lock, and the wind came up off the dry Texas plains and stirred the dust. And somewhere far off, a coyote called once, and the little gray house sat quiet under the stars, with everything precious in the world to Luke Walker sleeping inside it, and everything that would soon come to tear it apart, already rolling west on iron rails through the dark. Luke was up before the sun, and by the time Margaret came out to the porch with the coffee, he'd already got the wagon hitched and his good rope coiled on the seat, and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. "Where you headed so early?" she asked. "Town. Halloran's holding his summer buy at the stockyard come Saturday. That's 3 days off." He took the coffee and drank it standing. "I aim to be ready for him." "Ready how? You said weigh my own beef. On my own scale. In front of a witness." He set the cup down. "I got no scale worth the name. But Fletcher's got a platform scale at the Mercantile certified by the county, and I mean to borrow it or rent it or haul the whole thing out here on this wagon if I have to. And I mean to weigh every last head before that man lays eyes on 'em." Margaret studied him a long moment. "You believe me, then? About the numbers?" "Margaret." Luke looked at her steady. "I believed you the second you laid that pencil down. What I didn't have was the sand to do something about it. I got it now." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "You gave it to me." She stood on the porch and watched him drive off into the gray light, and something warm and unfamiliar turned over in her chest, and she pressed her hand flat against it, like she could hold it still. He came back that evening with Fletcher's platform scale roped into the wagon bed, and Fletcher himself riding alongside on a bay mare, because the storekeeper had said a certified scale didn't leave his premises without him leaving with it, and besides, he'd added, he had a mind to see how this played out. "Word's already around town, Walker," Fletcher said, climbing down. "You borrowing my scale 3 days before Halloran's buy? Everybody knows what that means." "And what's it mean?" "Means you think you've been cheated, means you aim to prove it." Fletcher scratched his jaw. "Halloran's been buying beef out of this county 11 years. Half these ranchers owe him money or think they're friends with him or both. You go accusing that man in front of God and everybody, and you better be right or you'll be the one run out of town, not him." "I'll be right," Luke said. He looked at Margaret when he said it. They weighed cattle for 2 days. Old Pete cut them out of the pasture one at a time. Luke drove them up onto Fletcher's platform, and Margaret stood at the head of it, with the ledger open on a barrel top, and wrote down every number in her small, precise hand, head by head, no rounding, no guessing the true weight of every animal Luke owned. It was slow work in the heat, and Emily carried water to all of them, and thought it was the finest game she'd ever played, and by the second evening, they had a full page of figures nobody could argue with. 41 head fit to sell, Margaret said, running her thumb down the column. Total weight, honest weight, my own eyes on the scale. She looked up. Now we'll see what Mr. Halloran says the same 41 head weigh, and if there's daylight between his number and mine, we'll have him. Saturday they drove the herd to town. The stockyard was crowded ranchers, and their hands and half the idlers in the county, because a cattle buy was as close to a holiday as Abilene got, and word of what Luke Walker was up to had spread thick as flies. Carl Dunmore was there with his boys, leaned up against the rail, chewing on a matchstick watching. The sheriff was there, a long, lean man named Boone, who kept his opinions behind his teeth. And Halloran was there, a fat, smiling man in a good gray coat and a gold watch chain, standing by his own set of scales with a ledger of his own and 2 hired men to work the pens. Luke Walker. Halloran boomed all warmth. Been buying your beef going on 5 years, son. Always a pleasure. Bring 'em up, let's get you paid. I'll bring 'em up, Luke said, but I'll be reading my own weights off my own scale, and you'll read yours and we'll see. Do they match? The stockyard went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a chair scrapes back too fast. Halloran's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. Now what's all this, Luke, you calling my scale crooked? That scale's been fair to every man in this county for 11 years. I ain't calling anything, Luke said. I'm saying we'll weigh 'em twice and compare. If your scale's fair, no harm done. If it ain't, well. He let it hang. You got a reason not to. Course I got no reason. Halloran laughed, but it came out thin. Weigh 'em twice, weigh 'em 10 times makes no difference to an honest man. Bring up the first one. They brought up the first steer. Halloran's man called the weight off Halloran's scale. 940 pounds. Margaret, standing at Fletcher's certified platform not 30 feet off, called out her own. 953. A murmur ran through the crowd. 13 pounds, Fletcher said loudly because he was county-appointed, and this was exactly the kind of thing a county-appointed man loved. 13 pounds light on the buyer's scale. Scales differ, Halloran said quickly. 0.5%, that's nothing. That's dust in the wind. Any 2 scales in Texas'll. Bring up the next one, Luke said. 910 called Halloran's man. 922 called Margaret. 12 pounds, Fletcher sang out. Next one. 11 pounds. Then 14. Then 12 again. Head after head, the same story. Halloran's scale always light, always by 10 or 12 or 14 pounds. Never once heavy, never once. Even always in the buyer's favor. And with every animal the crowd pressed closer, and the murmur grew. And Carl Dunmore's matchstick stopped moving in his teeth, and the sheriff pushed off the rail he'd been leaning on and came a few steps nearer. That ain't scales differing, somebody in the crowd said loud. Scales differing goes both ways. That there only goes one way. You weighed my beef last spring, another rancher called out, a young fellow named Tyree, with a hard new suspicion on his face. You weigh it light too. Halloran, you been shorting me. You've been shorting all of us, said a third. Halloran's smile was gone entirely now, and his fat face had gone the color of tallow, and he held up both hands. Gentlemen, there's an explanation. A scale gets off true. It happens. I'll have it looked at. You'll settle up, Margaret Walker said. She had come down off the platform and crossed the yard, and she stood now in front of Halloran with the ledger held against her chest, a large, plain woman in a brown dress, and every man in that stockyard turned to look at her. And some of them started to smirk the way they always did, and the smirks died on their faces when she started to talk. I've got 4 years of your buys in this book, Mr. Halloran. My husband's own tallies against your payments. And I sat down and did the figuring. She opened it. Head by head, season by season, you have shorted this ranch $1,140. That's not my temper talking, sir. That's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't lose its head, or take a bribe, or back down. She looked up at him. And judging by these gentlemen's faces, you've done the same to every trusting soul in this county who never thought to weigh his own beef. So here's how it'll go. You'll pay my husband what you owe him, today, in cash. Off that fat roll I can see in your coat. And then you'll settle with every other man here who wants his book gone through, and I'll go through them my own self for free, till every dollar you stole walks back into the pocket it came out of. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Halloran made his mistake. He looked at her, this woman the whole county had been laughing at for 2 weeks, and he sneered and he said, "And who in the blazes are you to talk figures to me? Sit down, you fat." He never finished it. Luke Walker crossed the ground between them so fast that Halloran got out one strangled sound before Luke had a fistful of that good gray coat and the fat buyer up on his toes. "That's my wife," Luke said, very quiet, right into the man's face. "You'll speak to her respectful, or you won't speak at all. You understand me?" "Walker." Halloran gasped. "You understand me?" "I understand." Halloran wheezed. "I understand. Let go. Let go of me." Luke let him down. Halloran staggered back, straightening his coat with shaking hands, and he looked around the ring of hard faces closing in on him. Ranchers he'd cheated for 11 years, and the sheriff standing with his thumbs in his belt watching, and he understood at last that there was no smiling his way out of this yard. "Fine," he spat. "Fine, 1,140. I'll pay it. It's a misunderstanding, but I'll pay it to keep the peace." His 2 hired men had drifted in from the pens, though, and one of them let his hand fall slow toward his hip, and for half a breath the whole yard went tight as a drawn wire. Sheriff Boone didn't hurry. He just turned his head and looked at the man mild and said, "Son, there's 40 ranchers in this yard, and every one of them just watched your boss rob 'em for 11 years. You clear that iron, and you won't leave standing. Now put your hand where I can see it, and let's all keep this a business matter." The hired man looked at the 40 hard faces. He put his hand where the sheriff could see it. "Wise," Boone said, and spat. "Cash," Margaret said, picking the thread right back up like nothing had happened. "And a receipt in this book, signed in your hand, saying paid in full, and admitting the error. So there's no misunderstanding next time either." Halloran signed the book. His hand shook so bad the letters crawled. He counted $1,140 out of the roll in his coat into Luke's palm, and it about emptied him, and when he was done, Sheriff Boone stepped up and said mild, "As you please. Mr. Halloran, I believe these other gentlemen would like a word with you before you leave the county. Reckon you'll want to stay a spell." "That's robbery," Halloran said. "That's mob robbery, that's arithmetic," said Margaret Walker, and closed the book. The crowd laughed, but it was a different laugh than the one on the train platform 2 weeks before. This time, they weren't laughing at her. This time, God help them, they were laughing with her. And Luke stood there with $1,140 in his fist, and his wife beside him, and he felt 10 feet tall. They rode home rich, or what passed for rich, and Emily rode in the wagon bed, clutching a paper sack of horehound candy Luke had bought her out of pure joy, and she sang the whole way home, some tuneless made-up song about candy and cattle, and Luke and Margaret sat up front and didn't say much because some things are too big to talk over right away. Finally, near home, Luke said, "You know what you did back there?" "I did some figuring is all." "No." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You walked into a yard full of men who spent 2 weeks calling you names, and you got up in front of every one of them, and you saved my ranch. That's what you did. That 1,100 is near exactly what I owe the bank come November. You just bought me my land back with a pencil and a book, and more nerve than any man in that yard." His voice roughened. "My first wife couldn't have done that. My own self couldn't have done it. There ain't 3 people in this county could have done what you did today." Margaret looked at her hands. "I didn't do it for the county's good opinion." "I know why you did it." "Do you?" "You did it," Luke said, "because you decided this was your family, and you don't let anybody rob your family, do you?" Margaret didn't answer. But she reached over and put her hand on his arm, and this time she didn't take it back quick like it wasn't allowed, and Luke covered it with his own rough and warm, and they rode the last mile home like that, and it was the closest thing to courting either one of them had done in years. The ranch began to turn after that. It wasn't magic and it wasn't quick, but it turned. Monday morning, Luke rode into town and walked into the cattleman's bank and laid $200 on the note 4 months early, just to watch the banker's face do what it did. The banker was a smooth, pale man named Prescott, who wore his collars too tight and never quite looked a working man in the eye, and he counted the money twice like he expected it to be counterfeit. "Well," Prescott said, "this is unexpected, Mr. Walker. I confess the bank had rather written off your prospects. Where does a man in your circumstances come by $200, if I may ask?" "You may not," Luke said pleasantly. "Just credit the note and give me my receipt." Prescott's mouth pinched. "There's no call to be short. The bank takes an interest in its debtors' affairs. It's only prudent." He wrote out the receipt slow, and as he passed it across he said casual as anything, "I understand your new wife has quite a head for figures. Quite a head. Been going through the county's books, they say, uncovering all manner of things." His pale eyes came up at last. "It's admirable. But a man in your position might counsel her to be careful. There's folks in this county don't care to have their affairs looked into. Powerful folks. Mr. Dunmore for one holds paper on half this town same as we do. A woman who goes turning over rocks might turn over one she wishes she'd left alone." Luke took his receipt and folded it slow and put it in his shirt pocket. "That a threat, Prescott?" "A courtesy," the banker said, smiling with his mouth only. "Merely a courtesy. Good day, Mr. Walker. Do give my regards to the missus." Luke rode home with that pale, smiling face stuck in his craw, and he didn't mention it to Margaret because she had troubles enough. But he filed it away. Dunmore and Prescott thick as thieves, and both of them, all of a sudden, mighty curious about a fat mail-order bride and her sharp pencil. It was one more small wrong note in a song that was starting to sound off-key all over. Still the ranch turned. Luke bought good feed with a little of the Halloran money and put weight back on the breeding stock. Word had got around about Margaret and the ledger, and one by one the other cheated ranchers came riding out to the Walker place hat in hand, asking would the missus look over their books too, and she did every one, and she found Halloran's thieving in near all of them, and by the end of the month the fat buyer had paid back better than $4,000 across the county, and left Texas for good, with the sheriff watching him to the county line. And a strange thing happened. The women who'd called Margaret the fat male bride at the mercantile started one at a time finding reasons to be neighborly. A pie left on the porch. An invitation to the church social. Mrs. Tyree, whose husband had got $200 back, thanks to Margaret's book, came out personal to say thank you, and stayed 2 hours drinking coffee. And when she left, she took Margaret's hand and said, "I'm ashamed of how I talked. I truly am. You're twice the woman I gave you credit for." And Margaret said gracious, "You're kind to say so," and never once threw the old cruelty back in her face, and that mercy did more for her standing in that county than the whole $1,100. The next Sunday, for the first time, the Walkers went to the church social. Margaret hadn't wanted to. "They'll stare," she'd said. "They always stare." "Let 'em stare," Luke said. "Let 'em stare at the woman who got half this county's money back for 'em. You've got more right to stand in that churchyard than any soul there." So they went, and folks did stare. At first the old way, and then Mrs. Tyree came right over and took Margaret by the arm and walked her into the thick of the women like she belonged there, which she did. And by the end of the afternoon, Margaret Walker was sat at the head of a long table with a slice of somebody's pie in front of her, laughing at some story, and 3 different women were asking her advice on their household accounts. And Luke stood off by the horses with the men and watched his wife, and could not for the life of him keep the grin off his face. "She's a fine woman, your missus," said young Tyree, coming up beside him. "I'll own I was one of the ones laughed on that platform. I'm ashamed of it now." "She's the finest thing ever happened to me," Luke said. "And I near let a train platform full of fools talk me out of seeing it." Emily tore past, just then, chasing the other children gap-toothed and shrieking with joy, happier than Luke had seen her since before her mother died, and she stopped long enough to fling her arms around Margaret's neck for no reason at all. Just because. And then ran off again, and Margaret's face when the child hugged her was a thing Luke knew he'd remember on his deathbed. For one golden afternoon, the Walkers were just a family like any other in the sun among friends. It was the last easy day they would have for a long while. Only Carl Dunmore and his wife held out. Dunmore had watched his neighbors turn friendly to the Walkers, and it curdled something in him, because Dunmore was a man who needed somebody beneath him, and he'd counted on the fat male bride to be beneath him permanent. And now here she was, making him look small. Enjoy it while it lasts. Walker, Dunmore said one day, meeting them on the road into town. He said it to Luke, but he looked at Margaret. A fat woman with a sharp pencil. Reckon that's a wonder. But wonders wear off. And a body's got to ask, don't it, where a plain mail-order bride learned to read a ledger like a Fort Worth banker? Makes a man curious. Where'd you learn that Mrs. Who taught a woman like you her sums? Margaret's face didn't change, but Luke, who was learning to read her, now saw something behind her eyes go still and careful, the way it had gone still on the train platform. My father taught me Mr. Dunmore, she said evenly. He believed a woman ought to know her figures. He was right. Your father. Dunmore chewed on it. And what did your father do that he taught his girl bankers sums? He worked, Margaret said, same as everybody. Good day to you. She clucked to the mules and drove on, and she left Carl Dunmore sitting his horse in the road, and Luke watched her hands on the reins and saw the knuckles gone white. Margaret, he said, once they were well past. What did he mean by that? Where'd you learn your figures? My father taught me, like I said. And what did your father do? For a long moment, the only sound was the mules and the wheels. He's dead now, Margaret said finally. That's what my father does. He's dead and he's gone, and I don't like to talk about him, Luke, so I'll ask you please to let it lie. Her voice caught just barely. There's things I'll tell you when it's time. I told you that first night. Please, just a little longer. Let it lie. And Luke, because he loved her now, and he did, he'd have owned it if you asked him, let it lie. But it didn't lie easy in his own chest. Because he'd heard her out on that porch in the dark, hadn't he? I'm sorry, Papa. I found it. After all this time. And now Dunmore of all people was sniffing at the same trail, asking the same question. Where did a plain mail-order bride learn to count like a banker? And Luke didn't have an answer, and it gnawed at him. That night Emily wouldn't sleep. She lay in the loft and called down that she wasn't tired, and then that she was thirsty, and then that she heard a noise, all the old tricks. And finally Margaret climbed up the ladder, which was no small thing, and lay down beside the child in the narrow bed, and Luke down below heard the whole of what came next through the loose boards, and he never told either of them that he had. Why won't you sleep, sugar? Margaret asked. 'Cause I'm scared. Scared of what? Emily was quiet, then small. Scared you're gonna leave. Margaret didn't answer right off. My other mama left, Emily said. She got sick and she left and she didn't come back. And you might get sick. Or you might just go like the ladies in town said. Mrs. Dunmore said you was a mistake, and Pa'd send you back. I heard her, and I don't want you sent back. I don't want you to leave like Mama did. The child's voice broke apart. So I don't want to go to sleep, 'cause if I stay awake, I'll know if you go. Down below, Luke Walker sat very still in the dark with his eyes squeezed shut. Emily, Margaret said. Her voice was thick. Look at me, honey. I want you to hear this, and I want you to remember it your whole life long, all right. A pause. There is nothing on this earth that could make me leave you. You hear? Not sickness, not the town, not Mrs. Dunmore, not the bank, not a flood, not a fire, not the devil himself walking up that road. I have waited my whole life for a little girl to call me Mama, and now I've got one, and I am not going anywhere, not ever, not for anything. And if anybody at all ever tries to take me from you, they are going to find out that I am the hardest thing to move in the whole state of Texas. A wet little laugh, which given my size oughtn't surprise a soul. Emily laughed too, hiccuping through her tears. Now you sleep, Margaret said softly. I'll be right here when you wake. I'll be right here every morning for the rest of your life. That's a promise, and I don't break promises. Not to my girl. My girl? Emily repeated wonderingly. Am I your girl? You're my girl. Been my girl since the minute you asked me on that train. The loft went quiet. Presently, the child's breathing went slow and deep and even, and after a while Margaret climbed careful back down the ladder, and she found Luke sitting there at the table in the dark, with his face wet, and she stopped. You heard, she said. I heard. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Luke stood up, and he crossed the little room, and he took his wife's face in both his rough hands, gentle as he knew how. And he kissed her once slow, and it was the first time, and when he drew back he said, I ain't ever gonna let anybody take you from us. You hear me? The same as she did. Whatever's in that trunk, whatever you're running from, whoever taught you your figures, it don't matter to me, and it won't matter come what may. You're a Walker now. You're ours, and a Walker stands by his own. Margaret Walker, who had faced down a cheating cattle buyer and a whole cruel county without so much as blinking, put her face against her husband's chest and cried like the girl she'd never got to be. They should have had more time. Folks like that who've earned a little happiness the hard way, they ought to be let keep it a while. But the world doesn't run on aught, and it never did. And the reckoning that had been rolling toward the Walker Ranch on iron rails for 2 weeks now was very close. It came first, as a rumor, the way trouble likes to. Fletcher rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday, and he didn't get down off his mare, and that alone told Luke something was wrong, because Fletcher never passed up a chance to sit and jaw. Luke, the storekeeper said. Mrs. He nodded to Margaret, and there was something uneasy in it. I got no business bringing this out here, and maybe it's nothing, but I'd want to know, was it me? So here it is. He wet his lips. There's a man in town been asking after your wife. Luke felt Margaret go still beside him. What kind of man? Luke said. City man. Eastern by his talk. Fine gray suit, city hat, soft hands, never done a lick of work in his life. Came in on the noon train yesterday and took a room at the hotel, and he's been buying drinks and asking questions. Fletcher looked at Margaret, and his voice gentled. He's been asking after a woman. Large woman, he says. Come out from the east some weeks back, he says. Maybe traveling under a different name, he says. The storekeeper swallowed. He didn't say Walker. He said the name Bennett. And he's got a photograph he's been showing folks, and Verna down at the hotel says the woman in that photograph is younger and finer dressed. But it's you, missus. She'd swear it's you. Margaret said nothing at all. Her face had gone white. There's 2 more with him. Fletcher went on quieter still. Come in on the same train. They don't ask questions, those 2. They just stand around and watch. And Verna says one of 'em's got a shape under his coat she didn't like the look of. He gathered his reins. Now maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a mix-up. But 3 Eastern men, one with a lawyer's tongue and one with a gun under his coat, riding all the way to Abilene, Texas, asking after a large woman named Bennett. He stopped. I figured you'd want to know they're coming. That's all. I figured you'd want the head start. He tipped his hat and rode off, and Luke and Margaret stood in the yard and watched him go, and neither of them moved for a long, long moment. Margaret spoke first, and her voice came out strange and flat, like a woman reading her own sentence off a page. How many did he say? 3. 3. One that talks, 2 that don't. And a photograph. She closed her eyes. A photograph. Then it's them. It's really them. I told myself if I got far enough, plain enough, quiet enough, they'd never... She stopped. I was a fool. You can't outrun money, Luke. Money's got long arms and a good memory, and it never, ever quits. Margaret. Luke stepped in front of her, made her look at him. Who are they? Plain talk. Right now. I can't fight what I can't see. You can't fight them at all. She said it gentle, almost pitying, and that scared him worse than anything. That's what you don't understand yet. These aren't cattle thieves, Luke. These aren't Halloran with his crooked scale that you can shame in a stockyard. The man in the gray suit is a lawyer, and the 2 with him are the kind of men that lawyers' money can buy. and behind all three of them is a family with more money than this whole state has ever seen. And they have come all this way, spent all this money to find one thing. Her hand pressed flat against her chest over the key she wore. Me, and what I took from them. And they will not leave without it, and they will not care one particle who stands in the road between them and getting it. Then we go to the sheriff, and tell him what that 3 men in suits asked a hotel clerk a question. She shook her head. Boone's a fair man, but he can't arrest a suit for asking questions. And the minute I tell my side, the minute I say who I am, everything changes. You don't know what I'm going to show you, Luke. You think you do. You're standing there thinking my wife's got some sad secret, some trouble back east, and whatever it is, I'll stand by her. And you mean it, and God bless you for it, but you do not yet know what you're offering to stand next to. Then tell me. I'm about to. She looked toward the road toward town, toward the dust still hanging where Fletcher had gone. Because they're coming, and when they get here, I need you to already know so you can choose with your eyes open, whether to fight beside me, or put me and my trunk on a wagon and send us off down that road and save yourself and your girl. And I'll not hold it against you whichever you choose. A man's got a right to know what storm he's standing under before it breaks. Emily, Luke said suddenly. Where's Emily? Down at the creek, with Pete. Margaret drew a long breath. Good. She oughtn't hear this. Not yet. A child shouldn't have to carry it. She squared her shoulders, and something in her face set like cooling iron, the same look she'd worn walking across that stockyard, the look of a woman who has decided to stop running and turn and face the thing behind her. Come inside, Luke Walker. Come sit down. I'm going to tell you who you married. They went in. But she didn't sit. She walked past the table, past the stove, straight to the porch, straight to the great iron trunk sitting there under its oilcloth, where it had sat since the day she came, and she pulled the oilcloth off it, and she took the brass key from around her neck where she'd worn it against her skin every day and every night since St. Louis and Luke had never once seen it, never known it was there. You wanted to know what I'm running from, Luke Walker. You wanted to know who my father was, and where I learned my figures, and what a fat mail-order bride is doing, that 3 armed men had crossed the whole country to find her. The lock turned over with a heavy, oiled click. I'll show you, and once I show you, there's no unknowing it, and you may wish to God you'd never asked. But you've earned the truth, you and Emily both. She lifted the iron lid, and Luke Walker looked down into the trunk, and every thought in his head stopped dead, and the blood drained clean out of his face. Because whatever he had guessed was in that trunk. Whatever tale he'd told himself about old dishes and quilts and a woman's keepsakes, he had not guessed this. Not this. Not in 1,000 years of guessing. He put a hand out and gripped the porch post to steady himself. His mouth had gone dry. He looked at the trunk, and he looked at his wife's white waiting face, and he looked back down at what lay gleaming inside, and he understood all at once in one cold rush exactly why 3 men had crossed a continent, and exactly why she checked that lock every night of her life, and exactly what he and his little girl were standing in the road of. "Oh, Margaret," was all he could say. "Oh, sweet Lord, what have you gone and brought into my house?" It was gold. That was the first thing Luke's eyes could make sense of. Laid careful in rows along the bottom of the trunk, under a folded quilt, she'd drawn back bars of it dull and yellow and heavier looking than anything, had a right to be more gold than he'd known was in the whole state of Texas. And on top of the gold in flat leather cases and oilcloth wrappings papers. Stacks of papers tied in ribbon. He could read enough to know what he was looking at. Railroad bonds, the kind with fancy scrollwork and gold seals. Bank drafts drawn on institutions back east with names he'd only ever seen in newspapers, and deeds. Property deeds, a whole thick sheaf of them, and legal papers with wax seals, and a single long envelope on the very top, sealed and worn soft at the edges from handling. Luke Walker stood there and could not find his voice for a full minute. "How much?" he finally got out. "How much is that?" "I don't rightly know anymore," Margaret said quietly. "The gold alone is better than $60,000. The bonds and drafts near $400,000, last I did the figuring, and they've drawn interest since. The deeds are the bigger part. There's property in that stack, Luke, in Chicago, and St. Louis and Kansas City, worth more than all the rest put together. Rail yards, warehouses, whole blocks of city land. She said it flat-tired like a woman reciting a debt. All told, if you sold every stick of it tomorrow, you'd have something better than $2 million in your hand. Luke sat down on the porch bench because his legs told him to. $2 million, he repeated. He looked at his own hands, cracked and calloused and empty. He looked at his little gray house with the leaning barn. He looked at the woman the whole county had laughed at off a train. Margaret, you've been sleeping in my one-room house, milking my cows, falling down in my dust, taking cruelty off Carl Dunmore's wife. And the whole time you had $2 million locked up on my porch. Yes. Why? It came out of him raw. In God's name, why? A woman with that could live any place, buy anything, have any man in the country. And you answered a broke rancher's letter and came out here to fall in the mud. Why? And Margaret Walker told him. She'd carried it alone so long that once it started, it came out of her in a flood, and Luke sat there on the bench and did not interrupt her, and the sun crawled across the yard while she talked. My name isn't Bennett by chance, she began. My father was Charles Bennett. You'd not have heard of him out here, but back east, every man in a good suit knew that name. He built railroads, Luke. Not laid the track, built them, the whole enterprise, the financing and the surveying and the buying of the right-of-way, mile after mile after mile of it, from the time he was a young man with nothing till the day he died, one of the richest men in the country. And I was his only child. My mother died when I was small, same as your Emily's, and it was just the two of us. After that, my father and me in a great cold house full of servants, and he raised me himself near enough. She smiled, and it was a sad thing. He was not ashamed of me. That's the part folks never believe. A man that rich, an only daughter that looked like me, and he was not ashamed of me one day of his life. Other men would have hid me away, married me off quiet to whoever'd take the money. Not my father. He sat me down at his own desk from the time I was 10 years old, and he taught me the whole business. The figures, the contracts, how to read a ledger and how to read a man. Margaret, he'd say, the good Lord gave you a plain face and a fine mind, and the world will only ever look at the one, and that my girl is the most powerful advantage a person can have. They will underestimate you your whole life long. Let them. And while they are busy underestimating you, you will beat every last one of them. Her voice cracked on the last of it. She pressed her hand to her mouth a moment, then went on. He died 2 years ago. Sudden. His heart, the doctor said. I found him at his desk one morning cold with his pen still in his hand. She shut her eyes. And I have never for one day since believed it was his heart. My father was strong as an ox. He'd had no trouble, no warning. And there were people around him at the end, near the end, who stood to gain a very great deal by his dying just exactly when he did. Who? Luke said. His brother, my uncle, Cornelius Bennett. She said the name the way you'd name a sickness. And Cornelius's sons, my cousins, and the pack of lawyers they kept. Cornelius spent his whole life in my father's shadow, hating him for it, living off him, and hating him for that too. And when Papa died and the will was read, and it named me a woman, an unmarried woman, with a plain face, sole heir to everything, the whole railroad empire, every dollar, Cornelius Bennett could not abide it. He would not abide it. She opened her eyes. So he set out to take it. How's a man take what a will gives to somebody else? 2 ways, and he tried both. Margaret's voice hardened, and Luke heard in it for the first time the daughter of the man who'd built railroads. First, he tried the courts. He hired lawyers to argue that a woman, a spinster, a woman of my particular appearance, was not fit to manage such an estate. That I was feeble, nervous, unwell in my mind. That I ought to be made a ward and my uncle appointed to manage my affairs for my own protection. They had doctors ready to swear to it, doctors who'd never once examined me, doctors Cornelius paid. They had it half arranged before I even understood what was happening to me. Luke's fists had closed. They tried to lock you up, say you was crazy, to steal your money. To steal my father's life's work, yes. She nodded. And when I fought that, when I got my own lawyer, an honest one of the last men my father trusted, and I started to win, Cornelius went to the second way. And the second way, Luke, is the reason I'm sitting on your porch, and the reason 3 men are in your town right now, and the reason I have to tell you the ugly rest of it." She reached into the trunk and drew out the long-worn envelope from the very top and held it in her lap. "My lawyer came to me one night near frantic. He'd got word. Cornelius had given up on the courts because he was losing, and he'd decided that if he couldn't have me declared unfit, he'd have me declared dead. Or as good as. He had men, Luke. The kind of men money buys in a city that do a thing and leave no name behind. And my lawyer told me plain, 'Margaret, they mean to kill you. Within the month. And they've arranged it so it'll look like an accident or a robbery or your own nervous hand. And Cornelius will weep at your funeral and inherit everything, because with you gone, he's next in line.'" She looked at Luke. "That was the night I stopped being an heiress and started being a woman running for her life." "So you ran?" "I ran, but I'm my father's daughter, and I didn't run empty-handed." Something fierce and proud came into her plain face. "The night before I disappeared, I went to the bank and the vault and my father's office with my honest lawyer standing witness, and I took everything that was mine to take. The gold, the bonds, the drafts. And the deeds, Luke, the deeds, most of all, because deeds are the one thing Cornelius couldn't replace or forge his way around. The deeds are the true title to the whole empire, and whoever holds the deeds holds the railroad. I took them every one, and I put them in my mother's old trunk, and I bound it in iron, and I vanished. And nobody caught you. Nobody looked twice at me." And here she laughed, a real laugh, bitter and triumphant both. "That was the whole of it, Luke. That was my father's lesson come true the day I needed it most. Cornelius sent his men out searching for the Bennett heiress, and they searched the fine hotels and the first-class cars and the resorts and the spas everywhere a rich young woman might hide. They were looking for an heiress. They never once looked at the fat, plain woman traveling third class under the name of a dead schoolteacher buying her own ticket, carrying her own bag. I walked right past his men in the St. Louis depot, Luke, close enough to touch, and not one of them saw $2 million walk by, because all they saw was a fat woman in a brown dress. Her eyes shone. Every cruelty the world ever showed me, every laugh, every whisper, every time somebody looked at my body and decided there was nothing behind it worth their notice, all of it, my whole life of it, became the thing that saved my life. They could not see me, because they had never once bothered to look." Luke sat with that a long moment. "And the letter," he said slowly. "My letter. Send me a plain woman kind enough to love a lonely child. How'd that come to you of all the letters in the world? Chance, or Providence if you're a believing man, and I've come to be." Margaret smoothed the envelope in her lap. "I was in St. Louis, hidden, spending down what little cash I dared to spend, knowing I couldn't run forever, knowing a woman alone with a locked trunk draws the eye, no matter how plain she is. I needed to disappear complete. To become somebody so ordinary, so nothing that no searching man would ever think to look. And a mail-order bride out on a poor ranch in Texas under a married name in a place with no railroads and no society and no soul who'd ever heard of Charles Bennett." She spread her hands. "There's no better hiding place on earth. So I went to the agency. And they had a stack of letters from lonely men wanting wives, and most of them Luke. Most of them broke my heart the wrong way. Wanting a young, pretty thing. Wanting a strong back for the work. Wanting a housekeeper they didn't have to pay." She lifted the worn envelope, and Luke understood all at once that this was his own letter, that she'd carried it in that trunk, with the gold and the deeds that she'd kept it. "And then there was yours. Send me a plain woman, someone kind enough to love a lonely child." And I read it, and I read it again, and I thought, there is a man asking for the one thing I have got that nobody ever wanted. Not my face, not my money. A kind heart to love a lonely child. And I thought, Margaret Bennett, you have run from people your whole life who only wanted what you had. Here is a man who wants only what you are. Her voice broke clean apart. "So I chose you, Luke Walker. Out of all of them, I chose you. Not to hide, or not only to hide. I chose you because you were the first person in my whole life who asked for me, and not for anything I carried in a trunk." For a long while, neither of them said anything at all. Then Luke Walker got up off the bench, and he came and stood in front of his wife, and he reached down and closed the lid of the trunk, gentle shutting away the gold and the deeds, and the whole $2 million of it, and he took both her hands in his. "Margaret," he said, "I want you to hear me, and I want you to believe me because I'm only going to say it the once. I don't want that." He nodded down at the trunk. "Not the gold, not the bonds, not one deed nor $1 of it. I never asked for your fortune. I asked for a woman kind enough to love my little girl, and God sent me the finest one that ever drew breath, and if you tipped that whole trunk into the creek tomorrow, I'd love you not 1 inch less. You understand me. It was never your money I married. It was your heart. And your heart is the richest thing that's ever set foot on this ranch, and it was rich long before I ever knew there was a lick of gold in that box." Margaret Walker put her face in her hands and wept, and Luke gathered her in all of her, and held her while she shook, and over the top of her head he looked out at the road toward town where 3 men were waiting, and his jaw set hard as flint. "They ain't taking you," he said low to nobody, to the road, to the whole wide, cruel world. "They ain't taking 1 hair of you, not while I'm standing." That was when Emily came running up from the creek. She came pelting into the yard with old Pete hobbling behind her, wet to the knees and grinning, hollering, "Mama, Mama, I caught a frog, come see, come." And she pulled up short at the sight of them, her father with his arms around her mother crying, the great trunk sitting open-lidded and just now shut, and her small face went uncertain. "Why's Mama crying? Is she sad?" Margaret wiped her face fast and got herself down to the child's level the way she had that first day on the platform. "No, baby, no, not sad. Your mama's just got a lot of feelings today is all, and sometimes feelings come out your eyes, whether you want 'em to or not." She managed a smile. "Now what's this about a frog?" But before Emily could answer, old Pete straightened up from catching his breath, and he was looking down the road, and his grin was gone. "Boss," he said, "riders comin'." Luke turned. 3 of them coming up the ranch road at an easy walk in no hurry at all, which was somehow worse than a gallop. 2 rode plain and watchful, the way men ride who are being paid to watch, and between them on a hired livery horse sat a slim man in a fine gray suit and a city hat, sitting his saddle like a man who'd rather be in a carriage, and even at that distance Luke could see the white of the papers in the leather case across his lap. "Pete," Luke said, quiet and quick, "take Emily. In the house. Bar the back and don't open it for anybody but me or her voice. Go." "Pa," Emily started. "Now, sugar, mind me. Go with Pete." He crouched fast and kissed the top of her head. "Everything's fine. Pa's just got some business. You go on, and I'll come get you when it's done." Old Pete scooped the child up, protesting, and carried her into the house, and Luke heard the bar drop across the door, and then it was just him and Margaret standing in the yard with the trunk and the 3 riders coming on. "Margaret." Luke didn't look at her. He was watching the riders. "You get behind me." "No." She came and stood square beside him instead, and Luke glanced over and saw her face had gone hard and still, and utterly without fear. The face of Charles Bennett's daughter. And he understood that whatever was about to happen, this woman had faced worse than 3 riders in a Texas yard, and had not run then either. "No, Luke, I've hidden behind my whole life, behind my father, behind that trunk, behind a false name. I'm done hiding. Whatever this is, we stand in it together out in the open where I can look them in the eye. That's the only way I mean to do it from here on." Luke looked at her 1 second longer. Then he nodded once and shifted his stance so their shoulders near touched, and together they faced the road. The riders came into the yard and stopped a dozen feet off. The 2 hard men reined up and sat easy, hands loose, eyes moving over the yard, the barn, the house, the trunk missing nothing. The man in the gray suit walked his livery horse a step nearer, and stopped and looked down at Margaret with a thin, pleased, terrible smile. the smile of a hunter who has run his quarry to ground at last. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was smooth as poured cream and just as cold. "How very far you've come, and how very small you've made yourself. I confess we nearly gave you up. My employer will be so relieved." He touched his hat brim, mockery in it. "Ambrose Sterling. I have the honor of representing the family of the late Charles Bennet. We have a great deal to discuss." "It's Mrs. Walker now," Margaret said evenly. "And I know exactly who you represent, Mr. Sterling. You represent a murderer." Sterling's smile didn't so much as flicker. "Strong words, and such an imagination. My employer warned me of your nervous condition, the delusions, the wild accusations. It's precisely why he's so concerned for your welfare." He turned that smooth smile on Luke, sizing him up, filing him away. "And you would be the husband, the rancher. Mr. Walker is it. You have my sympathy, sir. You could not possibly have known when you sent away for a bride what a troubled and dangerous woman you were inviting into your home, around your child." A pause, delicate as a knife. "You do have a little girl, I understand." Luke took one step forward before he knew he'd done it. "You want to be real careful," he said, "how you say my daughter's name." "I've not said it at all," Sterling replied mildly. "I've merely observed that she exists, and that a man ought to think hard about the company he keeps her in." He swung down off his horse unhurried, and one of the hard men dismounted with him and drifted a few steps wide, and Luke marked it the way they were spreading. The way a man does who means for you to have to look two directions at once. "Let me lay it out for you plainly, Mr. Walker, since you're plainly a plain-dealing man. The woman standing beside you is not the poor plain bride you believe her to be. Her name is Margaret Bennet. 2 years ago, upon the death of her father, she robbed the Bennet family of a fortune in gold securities and property deeds and fled. Robbed. There is a warrant. There are witnesses. And I have ridden a very long way to recover that stolen property and see her answer for the theft." He let it settle. "It's all in this case sworn and sealed. So, you may hand her and the trunk over to me now quietly, and I will see to it that no trouble whatsoever falls on you or your child. Or you may make this difficult and discover just how difficult my employer can make a man's life when that man stands between him and what he's owed." "It's a lie," Margaret said. "Every word. The property is mine, left to me free and clear by my own father's will. I didn't steal it. I saved it from a man who murdered my father to get it and meant to murder me next. So you keep saying." Sterling sighed, patient as a schoolteacher with a slow child. "And yet, here is a warrant. Here is a bill of particulars. Here is a sworn statement from your uncle and from your cousins and from the family's council of record. And there," he nodded at the iron trunk, "is a great deal of the family's gold in a stranger's yard in a woman's illegal possession. To any sheriff in this country, Mrs. Walker, that is not a widow's inheritance. That is stolen goods and a thief caught red-handed." His smile widened, and now there was real malice in it, cold and enjoying itself. "You've been very clever hiding, but clever runs out. You cannot argue paper, and I have all the paper." And that Luke understood with a sick lurch was the true trap of it. Margaret was innocent. He knew it in his bones. But Sterling was right about the one thing that mattered out here on the edge of the world. He had the papers. He had the warrant, the seals, the sworn oaths of respectable Boston men. And Margaret had the truth and a trunk full of gold that looked to any lawman's eye exactly like the gold a thief would flee with. "Sheriff's the law here," Luke said, buying time, thinking hard. "Not you, not your papers. If there's a warrant, it goes through Boone. That's how it's done in this county. I'd hoped you'd say that." Sterling's teeth showed. "Because I've already been to see your Sheriff Boone, this morning. Presented him my documents all in order, and he agreed that the matter warrants his attention." He drew a folded paper from his coat and held it up. "He's on his way here now, Mr. Walker, to take Mrs. Walker into custody, pending the return of the stolen property to its rightful owners. So you see, I'm not asking you to defy the law. I'm the one standing with the law. You're the one standing against it with a self-confessed fugitive in front of a trunk full of stolen gold." He let the paper fall to his side. "Now, where's your fine speech, cowboy? Where's your standing by your own? The law's coming up your road. Whose side will you be on when it gets here?" Luke's mind was racing. He looked at the road. Sure enough, more dust farther off, a single rider coming steady. Boone, the sheriff. "Margaret," he said under his breath fast. "Is there proof the will? The real will? You said your father's will named you. You got it. In that trunk." "I've got it," she breathed back. "The original. Signed, witnessed, sealed. My honest lawyer's copy, too. Then we don't fight Boone. We don't run. We show him. We put your paper up against his paper in the open, and we make Boone read both." Luke's jaw set. "Boone's a fair man. Fletcher said so. Dunmore couldn't buy him, and Halloran couldn't scare him. If there's one man in this county who'll look at the truth over a fancy seal, it's him. We don't hide the trunk. We open it. We show him everything, all of it. And we let the truth stand out in the sun, where these Boston buzzards can't smother it in the dark." "Luke!" Margaret's voice shook just slightly. "If Boone believes them, if he takes me, they'll have me on a train back east before you can hire a lawyer, and I will never see the inside of a Boston courtroom because I'll have an accident somewhere between here and there. A nervous woman, a fall from a train, and Cornelius will weep at my grave and take it all. That's not fear talking. That's exactly how these men work. If I leave this county in Sterling's keeping, I am dead, and everything my father built dies with me, and my girl grows up thinking her mama was a thief who ran off. If it comes to Boone taking me, Luke, I need you to know that." Something went very cold and very clear in Luke Walker then. "Then he ain't taking you," he said simply. "One way or the other." The single rider resolved into Sheriff Boone, and he came up the road at a walk and into the yard, and he took in the whole of it with one long sweep of his flat gray eyes. The two hard men, the lawyer, the rancher and his wife, shoulder to shoulder, the great iron trunk between them, and he did not get down off his horse right away. "Walker," Boone said. "Mrs." A pause. "Mr. Sterling here's brought me a passel of paper from Boston. Says your wife ain't who she claims. Says she's a thief with a fortune stole from her own family, and there's that trunk everybody in the county's been wondering on, and he wants her took into custody, and it took as evidence." Boone shifted his jaw. "I don't much like being handed a stack of Eastern paper and told what to do with my own county, but I don't get to like it. I got to follow it. So, somebody best start talking, and it best be good, because that paper's real enough, and that gold's real enough, and I got to do something about the both of 'em before the sun goes down." "Then you'll do it having heard both sides," Margaret said, and she stepped forward and she opened the trunk lid wide right there in the yard, in the daylight in front of the sheriff and the lawyer, and God, the way she'd told Luke she was done hiding. Sterling's smooth face went for the first time ever so slightly tight. "There's the gold, Sheriff," Margaret said. "Mr. Sterling's not lied about that. There it sits. And I'll not deny one bar of it is mine, and I'll not deny I fled with it, and I'll not deny my name is Bennett. So far, every word he's said is true." She reached into the trunk past the gold, and drew out the leather cases and the ribbon-bound papers, and last, a heavy folded document thick with seals. "But here's what Mr. Sterling brought no paper about. Here's my father's will, the true and only last will of Charles Bennett, signed in his own hand, witnessed by two men whose names are right here sealed and recorded in the probate court of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, on a date you can wire and confirm this very afternoon. Read it, Sheriff. Read who he left it all to." Her voice rang out clear across the yard. "He left it to me, his daughter. Every dollar free and clear. It is not stolen. You cannot steal what is already by law and by a dead man's own hand, entirely your own." Boone leaned down from his horse and took the document, and he unfolded it slow, and he read, moving his lips a little the way a careful man does, and the whole yard held its breath. "Sheriff," Sterling said, and his voice had lost some of its cream, "that document is a known forgery. It was set aside by the family. The operative will the later will is in my case, and it later will. Margaret rounded on him, and now the daughter of the railroad man was all the way out, fierce and blazing. There is no later will, Mr. Sterling, and you know it better than any man alive because you're the one who had it drawn up. That's the whole game, isn't it? You couldn't have me declared mad, and you couldn't quite manage to have me killed before I ran. So now you've done the third thing. You've forged a will. A new will dated after the real one that leaves everything to Cornelius and cuts me out. And you've got your paid doctors and your paid witnesses to swear my father signed it on his deathbed, and you've ridden all the way out here betting that some frontier sheriff will take a Boston lawyer's forged seal over a fat woman's word. She was shaking, but not with fear. Well, here's the thing you bet wrong on. My father taught me to keep proof. Sheriff in that stack tied in blue ribbon is a sworn deposition from Silas Crane, my father's own physician for 30 years. The man who signed the true death certificate, stating on his oath that my father was alone and unattended in the 3 days before he died, that no will was signed in that period, and that the signature on any such deathbed will is a forgery. Silas Crane, an honest man, who is not in Mr. Sterling's pocket because Mr. Sterling didn't know he existed. She jabbed a finger at the lawyer. Wire Boston, wire Silas Crane, wire the Suffolk County Probate Court. Wire any of it, all of it, and every wire that comes back will call this man a liar. The yard was dead silent. Sterling's smile was entirely gone now, and Luke, watching him close, saw the exact moment the man understood that his quarry had not been running blind after all. That the fat woman in the brown dress had brought her father's whole careful mind west with her in that trunk, and had just in front of a witness with a badge laid a live coal in the middle of his forgery. Sheriff, Sterling said, and his voice had gone hard and fast, dropping the smooth altogether. You are not equipped to adjudicate a contested Massachusetts estate in a cattle yard. No frontier lawman is. This must be settled in the proper courts back east, and until it is the prudent, the lawful course is to secure the disputed property and the person of the accused. Take her into custody. Take the trunk. Hold both pending extradition. That is not a judgment against her. It is simple procedure. And if you fail to follow it, sir, and this woman flees again, with a fortune that a Massachusetts court may well find belongs to my client, then it is you, Sheriff Boone, and this county that will answer for it. He'd found his footing again, and it was clever, and it was cold, and Luke felt the trap closing because there was just enough sense in it. Do your duty. Take her. Boone folded the will slow. He looked at the paper. He looked at Sterling. He looked at Margaret standing straight-backed and blazing beside her open trunk, and at Luke beside her, with his hand not far from his side. And Luke could see the man weighing it, the fair man caught between the paper in his hand and the paper in Sterling's case, between procedure and his own gut, and it could have gone either way, it truly could, and everything hung on it. And it was Fletcher who tipped it. Nobody had marked the second dust on the road, but here it came now, a fast buggy, and it swung into the yard, and old Fletcher hauled up the reins and was half out of the seat before the wheels stopped. Red-faced and breathing hard, and behind him climbing down. More careful was Mrs. Tyree and young Tyree on a horse behind that, and it seemed half the church social had gotten wind that trouble had ridden out to the Walker place and had come out to see about it. "Boone!" Fletcher hollered. "Boone, before you do a fool thing, I got something to say and you're going to hear it." He came puffing up, and he pointed a shaking finger at Sterling. "That man, that lawyer, you know what he done this morning before he ever come to you with his papers. He come to me first, to my store, and he tried to buy me. Offered me $200 cash to swear I'd sold goods to a woman I'd never laid eyes on to help build his story. $200 to lie about the missus." Fletcher's voice cracked with fury. "I told him where to put it. But a man who'll try to buy false witness against a woman in the morning, Boone, that's not a man whose sealed papers I'd trust in the afternoon. And I ain't the only one." He jerked his head at the Tyrees. "Ask around. He's been spreading money and lies all over this county for 2 days. That's not how an innocent man's lawyer behaves. That's how a guilty man's lawyer behaves. He offered my husband $100 too. Mrs. Tyree said, coming up chin high, to say the missus had been asking strange questions about trains and timetables like she was planning some crime. My Amos told him no. That woman found us $200 Halloran stole off us and never asked a dime for it. We know what she is, and we know what he is. She looked at Boone hard. You take that good woman off on this snake's word, Sheriff, and you'll answer to this whole county come election. The murmur that went through the gathering crowd was a hard one, and it was aimed at Sterling, and for the first time, one of the two hard men shifted uneasy, and let his hand drift toward his coat, and Luke marked it, and eased half a step to put himself between that man and Margaret. Boone sat his horse and looked at Sterling for a long, long moment. Mr. Sterling, the sheriff said at last, slow, you tried to buy false witness in my county this morning. That is a lie told by an ignorant shopkeeper who, two of 'em now, independent, Fletcher and Tyree, and I'd take either one's word over any 10 Boston lawyers. Boone leaned and spat. Now here's how it's going to be, and I'll say it once. I ain't taking this woman anywhere today. Not on your say-so. Not with two of my own townsfolk swearing you tried to suborn 'em not 3 hours past. He held up the will. This here says one thing. Your case says another, and there's a live way to settle which is true, which is to wire Boston Wire this Dr. Crane wire that probate court, and let honest men on both ends confirm the paper. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold the matter, and I'm going to send my wires, and until they come back, Mrs. Walker stays right here on her own land, with her own husband, and that trunk stays right where it is, and if it turns up moved or short 1 bar of gold, it'll be your neck. I come looking for, since you're the only one in this yard wants it gone. He straightened. You don't like it? You take it up with the judge. Meantime, you'll clear off this man's property and quit my county's roads, you and your 2 shootists both. And if I hear you've so much as looked cross-eyed at this family before my wires come back, I'll jail all 3 of you on Fletcher's complaint, and let the Boston courts wire about that. For one taut moment, Luke thought Sterling might push it. The lawyer's face had gone white with a fury that had nothing smooth left in it, and his eyes cut to his 2 hard men. And there was a half-second, a bad half-second, where the whole yard balanced on the edge of gunfire, the 2 shootists and the sheriff and Luke and a crowd of unarmed churchgoers, and Luke's whole body had gone tight and ready. Then Sterling let out a long breath, and the smooth mask came back down over his face, like a lid closing on a well, and he smiled his terrible thin smile, and he touched his hat. Of course, Sheriff, the law will have its process. I'm a great believer in process. He gathered his reins and swung up onto the livery horse, and he looked down at Margaret one last time, and what he said quiet, almost kind, so only the nearest could hear, and it was the most frightening thing he'd said all afternoon. You've won the afternoon, Miss Bennet. Enjoy it. But you should understand something about my employer. He has tried the courts, he has tried the doctors, he has now tried the law and been embarrassed. Cornelius Bennet is not a patient man, and he has never yet failed to get a thing he wanted, and he has spent 2 years and a great deal of money wanting this. I am Sharpie. He gathered the reins. There are ways to take a thing that don't require a sheriff's leave, or a judge's. Out here so far from anywhere with your cattle scattered over open range and your husband and your child under one thin roof. Wires can be cut. Accidents do happen on lonely ranches, and a dead woman's trunk, Miss Bennet, becomes a great deal easier to open. He tipped his hat, pleasant as Sunday. Do give it some thought. My offer to settle this quietly won't stand much longer. After that, it stops being my department. He wheeled the horse, and his 2 men fell in beside him, and the 3 of them rode out of the yard and down the road the way they'd come unhurried. And Luke Walker stood in the middle of his own land with his wife and his neighbors around him, and watched them go, and understood in his bones that they had won nothing at all. They had only bought a little time, and that the next time these men came, they would not come with papers. Margaret's hand found his and gripped it hard, and Luke looked over and saw that all the fierce blaze had gone out of her, and underneath it she was afraid, truly afraid, for the first time since the platform. He means it, she said very low so the crowd wouldn't hear. Everything he just said. He means every word. My uncle will burn this whole ranch to the ground and call it a prairie fire and take the gold out of the ashes, and there won't be paper enough in Texas to stop him." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I brought this to your door, Luke. To you and to Emily. I hid it, and I told myself I was keeping you safe by not telling, and instead, I've set my uncle's dogs loose right on top of the only family I ever had." Her eyes were wet and terrible. "Oh God, what have I done? What have I brought down on my girl?" And from the doorway of the little house, where old Pete had finally let her creep out to see, a small voice, having heard more than any of them knew, said into the sudden silence, "Mama, are the bad men gonna come back and hurt Pa?" And nobody in that yard had an answer for her, because the true answer was yes. Luke got down on his knee and pulled his daughter close and told her the only thing a father can tell a child at a time like that. "No, sugar. Nobody's gonna hurt your pa. You know why. Because your pa's got the two toughest women in Texas standing behind him. Ain't a soul on earth can beat that." He said it grinning, and Emily believed him because she was 6 and she loved him. But over her head, Luke's eyes found Margaret's, and neither one of them was grinning at all. They did not sleep easy after that any night. Luke sent old Pete to town with word, and the county answered. Young Tyree came out with his rifle and 2 of his hands. Fletcher closed his store and came. Half a dozen ranchers Margaret had saved from Halloran's cheating rode out to take turns standing watch, because that was how it worked out here. A man did for his neighbor, and trusted his neighbor to do for him, and Margaret Walker had done for near every one of them. For 4 nights, they kept a guard on the Walker place, and for 4 nights, nothing came, and a body started to hope, the way a body does that. Maybe the threats had been wind. One of Tyree's hands, a young fellow named Dobbs, said as much on the 3rd night, warming his hands at the watchfire, and he said it with a sideways smirk at the house. "All this fuss over a stack of paper and a fat woman's ghost stories. Reckon them city men's long gone. No sense a man losing sleep guarding a—" "You'll finish that different than you started it," Luke said quiet from the dark behind him. "Or you'll finish it off my land." Dobbs shut his mouth. "That woman found your boss's neighbors near $1,000 apiece." Luke went on, "and pulled a stampede off nobody knew was coming just by reading a storm right. You'll guard her house glad and grateful she lets you warm at her fire." He looked out at the black horizon. "And you'll pray them city men are long gone, Dobbs, because if they ain't, it won't be paper that comes up that road." Later in the dark of the house, Margaret found Luke at the window rifle across his knees, and she sat down beside him without a word, and took his hand, and they watched the road together, and neither said the thing they were both thinking, which was that 4 quiet nights only meant the storm was picking its moment. On the 5th night, the sky went wrong. It came up out of the southwest, a big, dry lightning storm rolling in, mean and low, the kind that spooks cattle worse than wolves, and Luke stood on the porch, watching it build, and felt his stomach drop, because he knew in his gut, that no cattle thief worth his pay would waste a night like this one. "Margaret," he said, "get Emily in the root cellar. Now. Pete, ride the fence line, check the herds bunched. Tyree, you and your boys take the—" He never finished. The first shots came from the dark down by the far pasture, 3 of them fast, and they weren't aimed at anybody. They were aimed at the sky over the herd, and Luke understood the whole plan in one sick heartbeat. They weren't coming for the house. They were coming for the cattle. Drive the whole herd screaming through the storm straight over the ranch, over the corrals, over anything and anybody in the way, and let it look like nothing but a stampede in a thunderstorm. God's own accident, and in the chaos and the dark do whatever else wanted doing. "Stampede!" Luke roared. "They're running the herd mount up, turn 'em away from the house." Then the thunder of it reached them, a sound like the world coming apart. 400 head of terrified cattle pouring out of the dark, and every man there flung himself onto a horse and rode straight into it, because that was the work, and there was no time to be afraid. What came next, Luke would never be able to lay out in order. There was only the flood of it, the horns and the eyes and the churning bodies, and him and Tyree, and the others riding hard along the flank of the herd, trying to bend it, screaming, firing over the animals' heads to turn them, and the lightning throwing everything white and gone, and somewhere out in it, the thieves whooping and driving the cattle on toward the buildings on purpose. They almost turned it. Luke got the leaders swinging wide away from the house, and for one breath he thought they'd done it. Then a lightning crack split a cottonwood not 30 feet off with a sound like a cannon, and the whole herd shied back the other way, and the leading edge of it slammed straight into the big corral, where Luke had penned the breeding stock, and the rails, old and wanting mending, same as everything on that place, went down like matchwood, and Luke Walker's horse went down with them. He felt the animal stumble on a fallen rail, felt it go over, and he kicked free just in time and hit the ground rolling and came up against the tangle of the collapsed corral with the whole world stampeding around him. He tried to rise. A beam had come down across his leg, pinning him, and above the fallen rails, a dozen head of his own maddened cattle were penned and wheeling, and any second they'd trample the wreckage flat and him under it. Luke. It was Tyree wheeling his horse, but he couldn't get near the cattle were between them. "Luke, I can't reach you." "Get back," Luke hollered. "Turn the herd, that's the work, get back and turn 'em," because he'd rather die under his own corral than have a neighbor die trying to pull him out. He heaved against the beam, and it would not move, and the penned cattle screamed and lunged, and Luke Walker understood cold and clear that he was going to die there in the mud in the rain, and his last thought was going to be for his girl. And out past the wreck, through a white lightning flash, Luke saw a thing that near stopped his heart, worse than the beam on his leg. One of the thieves had peeled off from the herd and turned his horse for the house, for the cellar door, for Emily. "The house!" Luke screamed, thrashing useless pinned. "Somebody, the house he's making for the cellar! Emily!" Old Pete heard him, 70 years old, half blind, and he wheeled his mule around and put himself square across the cellar door with nothing but a shotgun and a curse, and when the thief came on, he let go one barrel over the man's head, and one barrel a good deal lower, and the rider decided all at once that no locked trunk was worth a bellyful of buckshot, and hauled his horse off into the dark. The cellar door stayed shut. The child stayed safe. But for 3 heartbeats, Luke Walker had watched a man ride down on his daughter and could not move a muscle to stop it, and he would carry those 3 heartbeats to his grave. Then a lantern swung up out of the dark, and a voice cut across the whole roaring night, and it was Margaret. She had not gone to the cellar. She'd got Emily down there safe with Pete's granddaughter, and then she'd done the thing nobody expected. The thing a fat woman in a nightdress had no business doing. She'd waded straight out into the storm and the stampede on foot with a lantern in one hand and a coil of Luke's good rope over her shoulder, calling his name. "Luke Walker, you answer me." "Here," he screamed. "The corral, I'm pinned. Margaret, get back, get out of it." She did not get back. She came on. And here was the thing the whole county would tell for years after the thing that made grown men take off their hats. Margaret Walker walked up on the wreck of that corral where 12 head of crazed cattle were trampling toward her husband, and she did not scream and she did not run. She stopped at the broken rail, and she planted her considerable self square in the gap, and she flung both arms wide, and she bellowed at those animals in a voice that came up from the bottom of the earth. "Hya back you!" And the cattle balked. A big terrified steer bearing down on the gap saw a wall of a woman standing dead in its path with a swinging lantern and a voice like judgment, and it slid up short and wheeled, and the ones behind it wheeled with it. All that mass of them turning off Luke and away, because for all their panic they would not run straight over a thing that stood its ground and dared them to. She held the gap with her own body. This woman the town had called too big and too slow, and a mistake, and her size that they'd laughed at her size was the very thing a smaller woman they'd have run right down, but they could not make themselves charge her. "Tyree!" she roared, never taking her eyes off the animals. "Get your rope on that beam. There's 2 of us can pull where there was 1. Now, man, now." Gee. Tyree got his loop over the fallen beam and dallied it to his saddle horn, and Margaret took her own rope and threw a loop, the way her lantern light showed her clumsy and desperate and good enough, and got it round the beam's other end, and she set her whole enormous weight against it, and hauled, hauled like an ox, screaming at Tyree to back his horse, and between the horse and the woman, the beam groaned up off Luke's leg, maybe 6 inches, and Luke dragged himself free through the mud, and out under the rail, on his belly, out of the pen, out from under death. Margaret dropped the rope and got her arms under him, and hauled him up and back, both of them going down in the mud together, out of the gap clear, and the second they cleared it, the cattle broke through where they'd stood, and the whole ruined corral went to splinters behind them. For a moment, they just lay there in the rain, tangled up breathing. "You!" Luke gasped. "You came out into a stampede, on foot. You could have been killed 100 times over. Margaret, why in God's name?" "Because you're my family." She was crying, or maybe it was the rain, or both. "And I told that little girl in the loft, there wasn't nothing on this earth could make me leave. I meant it. Did you think I'd stand in a cellar and listen to you die?" Luke Walker looked at his wife. Mud to the elbows, hair torn down, gasping in the rain, having just faced down a stampede with her bare body to save his worthless life, and something broke open in his chest that had been closed a very long time. "I love you," he said. "God help me, I love you, Margaret, not the money. You. I've loved you since about the second day, and I've been too much a fool to say the whole word. I love you." "I know," she said, half laughing, half sobbing. "You great fool. I know. Now get up. There's still a herd to save and thieves to catch, and I did not drag your carcass out from under that beam so you could lie in the mud making speeches." They saved most of the herd. With Luke back up and Margaret shouting orders like her father surveying track, they got the men bent to it and turned the main body of cattle before it scattered clean to the horizon and lost fewer than a dozen head in the end. And they caught one of the thieves too, when the man's horse threw him in the dark, and old Pete, 70 years old and half blind, sat on his chest with a shotgun till Tyree came and tied him. That one thief was the thread that unraveled the whole thing. Because Sheriff Boone, when he came out at first light to a ruined corral and a tied-up cattle thief, did not treat it as any storm. He treated it as what it was. And the thief, looking at a Texas rope for stampeding a man's herd with intent to kill, sang like a Sunday choir. He named the man who'd hired him. He named the money. He named a lawyer in a gray suit who'd paid in Boston banknotes, and a plan to burn the ranch after and make it look like the storm's own work, and a locked iron trunk that was to be carried to a certain hotel room in town the moment the woman who kept it was dead. And that same morning Boone's wires came back from the east. They came back, every one against Sterling. Silas Crane, the honest doctor, confirmed on his oath there'd been no deathbed will. The Suffolk County Probate Court confirmed the true will. The one that named Margaret, filed and sealed on the very date she'd said. A Boston paper's editor even wired that questions had lately been raised about old Charles Bennett's sudden death and about his brother Cornelius, and that certain authorities would be most glad to learn the whereabouts of a witness like the daughter. Sterling and his 2 shootists tried to catch the noon train. Boone was waiting on the platform, Tyree and Fletcher, and 6 armed ranchers behind him, and the sheriff arrested all 3 on the cattle thief's sworn word before Sterling had 1 boot on the step, and if the lawyer's smooth face had anything smooth left in it, nobody on that platform saw it. They took his fine leather case, and inside it, they found the forged will, and it went east under guard as evidence against the very men who had made it. Cornelius Bennett, who had never once failed to get a thing he wanted, was going to answer in a Boston court for the murder of his own brother, and it was the fat, plain niece he had tried to erase who put the noose in the judge's hand. The trunk stayed locked on the Walker porch. Nobody ever came for it again. And then the strangest, sweetest part of the whole story began, the part that turned a county's heart clear around. Margaret Walker took her fortune out of the trunk at last. Not much of it, a small part. She had promised Luke she'd never married him for gold, and she never touched it for gold's sake. But there was a difference, she said, between living rich and doing good, and she meant to do some good with what her father had built. She dug wells. Deep, good wells, 3 of them, and not only on Walker land, but out where the poorest homesteaders had been hauling water for miles, and she asked nothing back for it. She bought strong new breeding cattle to replace what the drought and the stampede had taken, and she stocked not just her own range, but staked 2 young families who had been one bad season from giving up and going back east. When the ranch hands were paid that fall, they were paid fair and full, more than fair, and old Pete, who had worked for nothing but a bunk and beans for years, was handed a deed to 40 acres of his own, and wept like a child over it. Then she built the schoolhouse. The first real school for 40 miles, a good frame building with glass windows and a stove, and a teacher she sent all the way to Fort Worth to hire so the frontier children who'd grown up not knowing their letters, Emily's whole ragged little band of playmates, would know them now. And beside it, a small clinic with a doctor's rooms and a bed and medicines, because she had watched her own mother die for want of care, and she had watched Emily's mother die. The same, and she swore no ranch family in that county would ever again lose a soul just for help being too far. The women who had called her the fat male bride sent their children to her school. The men who had laughed on the train platform drank the water from her wells. Mrs. Dunmore herself, whose husband had lost his standing in the county when it came out, he'd whispered with Sterling in the hope of picking the Walkers clean, came to Margaret one evening with her hat in her hands and said she was ashamed, more ashamed than she knew how to say, and Margaret Walker took the woman's hand and said only, "We'll say no more about it. You'll come to the school dedication Saturday. Bring a pie." And that was all, and it was more than Mrs. Dunmore deserved, and everybody knew it, and it made Margaret bigger in that county than any Boston fortune ever could. Slowly, and then all at once, the whole of Abilene came to understand a thing about the woman they had mocked. That the day she stepped down off that train near 300 pounds in a brown dress that did not fit, and the whole town laughed, they had not been laughing at a mistake. They had only been too blind, every one of them, to see that the finest thing ever to come to their county had just climbed down off the noon train and asked a lonely little girl her name, and got down in the dust on one knee to hear all about a missing front tooth. Luke stood on his porch one evening at the end of it all, mended and whole, his healed leg under him and his saved ranch around him, and his wife inside teaching his daughter her letters by lamplight, and he looked out over land that had water in it again, and cattle fat on it again, and off in the distance the little schoolhouse she had built with its windows lit for a night class, and he took off his hat to the whole of it and to her, and his heart was too full to hold what was in it. Margaret came out onto the porch behind him and slipped her hand into his and stood there a while, looking out at the same lit windows of the same schoolhouse, and finally she said, "You know, Luke Walker, we never did have a proper wedding." He looked over at her. "We stood in front of the preacher, said the words, 'That's married.' We stood in a preacher's parlor with old Pete and a borrowed Bible, because I was hiding from 3 states, and you were half sorry you'd sent for me." She smiled, but her eyes were serious. That was a marriage of 2 people who didn't know each other, and were both a little afraid. "I'd like to marry the man I actually love, Luke. Out loud, in front of everybody, in the daylight where nobody's hiding from anything." Luke turned that over. Then a slow grin came up on him. "Under the old oak then, down by the creek. My granddaddy cleared this land under that tree. My mother was married under it." "Then that's where," Margaret said. They set it for the spring, and word went round the county, and the strangest thing happened, though. By then it oughtn't have surprised anybody. Every soul in Abilene wanted to come. The same town that had lined a train platform to laugh at a fat mail-order bride now near fought over who'd bring what dish, who'd loan chairs, who'd cut flowers, whose wagon would carry the older folks down to the creek. Mrs. Tyree took charge of the cooking like a general. Fletcher closed his store for the day and hung a sign that said, "Gone to the Walker wedding, be back Tuesday." Even Sheriff Boone, who never went anywhere, he wasn't paid to put on a clean collar and came. There was one bit of news that came in on the wind that same spring, and it settled the last of the old business. A letter reached Margaret from her father's honest lawyer back east, and she read it standing on the porch, and Luke watched her face and could not tell for a moment whether it was good or ill. Then she folded it and looked up, and there were tears in her eyes, but they were not sad ones. "Cornelius," she said, "my uncle, he was convicted, Luke, of my father's murder. The doctor's testimony, the forged will, that thief you helped catch out in the storm, all of it. 12 men heard it, and it took them 1 hour." Her voice trembled. "He's to hang for it. The man who poisoned my father and hunted me across a country and sent riders to trample my husband in a storm. It's finished. It's truly finished. There's not a soul left in this world who wants to take a thing from us." Luke pulled her in and held her and said, "Then your father can rest, and so can you." "So can I," she whispered, and something she had carried since the morning she found him cold at his desk, with the pen in his hand, finally, after 2 long years, set itself down. The wedding day came up clear and warm. They stood under the old oak by the creek, the whole county spread out in borrowed chairs and on quilts on the grass, and the preacher stood ready, and Luke waited at the front in his one good shirt mended and pressed, and his heart was going harder than it had the day of the stampede. But Margaret did not come down the path on any man's arm. She'd made a particular choice about that, and she'd told no one but the one who mattered. Emily brought her. The child came first down the path in a new blue dress, 7 years old now, and grown a full inch, that missing front tooth long since filled in by its grown-up neighbor. And she was holding her mother's hand and walking slow and solemn and proud as a queen, leading Margaret Walker down to be married, the way a grown woman would lead a bride because Emily had asked to, had begged to, had said it was her right, and no one in that county would have dared tell her otherwise. Halfway down the path, Emily stopped. She'd planned this part too. She turned and looked up the whole long way to Margaret's face the same way she had that first day on a dusty train platform in front of a whole cruel town, and this time the town leaned in to hear. "Mama," Emily said, clear as a church bell. "Before you go marry Pa, I got to tell you something, and I've been saving it." She took a breath. "The day you got off that train and everybody was laughing and I asked, 'Were you my new mama?' You didn't know it, but I already decided you was. Right then. And I've been calling you Mama in my heart for a long, long time, since before I was even allowed to out loud." Her small chin quivered. "So I don't just want you to marry Pa today. I want you to be my mama today, for real and for keeps and forever. Is that all right?" There was not a dry eye under that oak tree, nor for 50 yards around it. Margaret got down on her knee in the grass, which was no small thing, the same as it had been no small thing that first day, and she brought herself level with the child, and she said in a voice that barely held, "Emily Walker, I have been your mama in my heart since the same exact minute, and I would be prouder to be your mama today than I have ever been of one single thing in my whole entire life. Yes, baby, for real, for keeps, forever." And she kissed the child's forehead, and Emily flung both arms around her neck, and the two of them held each other there in the grass in front of everybody, and Luke Walker had to press the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. Then Emily took her mother's hand again, and lifted her chin, and walked her the rest of the way down, and put Margaret's hand into Luke's, and stepped back, satisfied, having done the most important job of her whole young life exactly right. Luke looked at his wife. This woman he had been ashamed of on a train platform less than a year ago, and he could not for the life of him remember what that shame had felt like, could not even imagine the fool who had felt it. "You came all this way," he said low, "just for her, and fell in my mud and took this town's cruelty and found my money and faced down a stampede and saved my life and my ranch and my little girl and my own sorry heart. And I get to marry you twice." He shook his head. "There ain't a luckier man drawing breath in the state of Texas." "Then say the words Luke Walker," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. "And this time mean everyone." He did. They both did. And when the preacher said he could kiss his bride, Luke Walker took his wife's plain beloved face in his 2 rough hands and kissed her slow and sure in front of God and Abilene and everybody. And the whole county came up off the grass hollering and clapping. And Carl Dunmore, standing in the back where a humbled man stands, took off his hat. And even he was clapping, because there is no heart so hard it can't be shamed all the way around to gladness by a thing that good. There was one more thing to do, and they did it together later when the party had wound down and the guests had gone home full and happy. They moved the great iron trunk in off the porch and into the house at last, into the front room, into the corner by the window where the evening light fell. But first they emptied it. The gold, the bonds, the deeds, The drafts. All of it. Margaret and Luke sorted through together at the kitchen table, and what needed keeping safe, they put in the new bank in town, the honest one under Boone's own eye, and what could do good, they set aside to keep on doing good. More wells, more cattle for more struggling families. A second teacher for the growing school. Margaret's fortune stopped being a secret she guarded in the dark, and became in the plain light of that front room, simply a tool, the way her father had always meant it to be for building things that lasted. And when the trunk was empty, Margaret called Emily over. "You remember," Margaret said, "what I told you was in this trunk that very first night you asked, and I said someday when you're bigger, I'd open it and show you every piece and tell you the story of each one." Emily's eyes went round. "I remember. The treasures." "Well, you're bigger now, and I keep my promises." Margaret smiled. "But here's a thing I've learned, baby, and I want you to hear it. The treasures that were in this trunk, the gold, and all those weren't ever the real ones. They were just money. Money's good for building schools and digging wells and keeping folks fed, and we'll use it that way all our lives. But it's not treasure. You know what treasure is?" "No." Emily said honestly, the same as she'd answered a version of that question a lifetime ago. "Treasure," Margaret said, "is this." And she took from her apron pocket the very first thing to go into the trunk in its new life. A drawing. A child's drawing in colored chalk of 3 stick figures, and a lopsided house, and a sway-backed horse that Emily had made her that very week with "M.I. Mama" lettered crooked across the top. Margaret laid it careful in the bottom of the great iron trunk in the place where the gold had been, and she smoothed it flat. "From here on," she said, "this trunk holds the real fortune. Your drawings, your pa's letters, the little dress you wore today, the good Christmas things, every Valentine and every lock of hair and every note we ever pass each other. It'll fill up over the years, and someday it'll be full, and when your own children ask you what's inside it, Emily Walker, you tell them the truth. You tell them it's the richest trunk in all of Texas, and it hasn't got one speck of gold left in it." Emily didn't fully understand it, not then. But she put her own drawing beside her mother's hands, and she understood enough. The years went on the way good years do, quiet and full, one folding into the next. The Walker Ranch prospered, but never the way Dunmore's had prospered, all show and pride. It prospered like a thing that is loved. The wells never ran dry, even in the bad years, and the neighbors remembered who had dug them. The schoolhouse filled and filled again, and grew a second room, and children who'd never have known their letters grew up to keep books of their own, and could not be cheated by any slick man with a crooked scale, because Margaret Walker had taught the whole county to read its own numbers. The clinic saved lives past counting mothers in childbed and men gored in the roundup and children down with the fever, and every one of them walking out well knew whose money had built the walls that saved them. And the ranch became known all across Texas for one thing above every other. Not for being the richest, though it did well. Not for the finest cattle, though they were fine. It became known as the place where no hungry traveler was ever turned away. Any soul who came up that road worn and empty, any drifter, any ruined family heading west with nothing, any child gone thin, they were fed at the Walker table, and rested in the Walker barn, and sent on with something in their belly, and something in their pack, and no one was ever once asked to pay or made to feel small for it. Margaret saw to that till the day she died, and after, because by then Emily was grown and ran the table exactly the same way, having learned it at her mother's knee. Folks came to understand over those years the whole strange story of the Walkers, how the mistress of that generous house had once stepped off a train to a town's laughter with a trunk full of gold no one could see. And the ones who'd been there, who'd stood on that platform and laughed, they didn't tell it with pride. They told it as a warning and as a lesson to their children and their children's children. There was a woman came to this county once, they'd say, and we judged her by her size and her plain face and her worn brown dress, and we called her a mistake, and we were fools. Because everything that made this county worth living in the water and the school and the doctor and the open table, every bit of it, came from the very woman we laughed at. We looked at the outside of her and saw nothing, and there was more inside that woman than in all the rest of us put together. Luke lived a long life and a happy one, and near the end of it he sat on that same porch one evening, an old man now gray and slow, and he watched his grandchildren playing in the yard, where he'd once been so ashamed of his leaning barn, and Margaret Gray herself. But her eyes the same, brought him his coffee, and sat down beside him, the way she had 10,000 evenings before. "You ever think," Luke said, "how close I come to being the biggest fool in Texas, standing on that platform, sorry I'd sent for you? If Emily hadn't walked up to you when I couldn't move my feet. If you'd got back on that train." "I wasn't going to get back on the train," Margaret said comfortably. "I'd already read your letter 40 times. I'd already picked you. You picked me." Luke shook his old head. "The richest woman in 3 states, and she picked a broke rancher and his motherless girl. And I stood there sorry about it." He reached over and took her hand, spotted and worn, now the same hand that had held the Gap against a stampede. "I spent my whole life thinking the biggest fortune ever to come to this ranch was locked up in that iron trunk. $2 million, gold and deeds and railroads." He looked at her, and his old eyes were wet. "And I was wrong about that too, same as I was wrong about everything the day you came. The fortune was never in the trunk, Margaret. It was you, your courage, your kindness. The way you loved a lonely child and a sorry man, and a whole cruel county that didn't deserve you, and never once measured any of us by what we'd done to you. That was the treasure. It was always you." Margaret Walker leaned her gray head on her husband's shoulder, and together they watched the grandchildren play in the last of the light, and neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. And this is the truth. The Walker family carried down through all the years that followed and told at every table. And the truth this whole story was ever meant to hold, that a person's worth is never once measured by the shape of their body, the plainness of their face, or the gold in their trunk. The ones the world overlooks the quickest are so often the ones carrying the greatest strength, the deepest kindness, and the richest hearts of all. And the truest fortune any soul will ever find is not the kind you can lock away behind iron bands and a brass key. It is love freely given integrity that will not bend, and the plain unshakable courage to build a family where every last person, no matter their size or their sorrow or their station, is told with open arms that they belong. That is the whole of it, and it is worth more than all the gold that ever crossed a Texas plain.